I was on the trail of a monster, one with fangs and a taste for humans. This vampire had attacked a monster hunter that I knew. It had bitten him, changing him, making him the monster. Only he had chosen oblivion over a future as a vampire. He had walked out into the sunlight and been burned away to dust. Night had fallen by the time that I began my pursuit. I was trying not to think about the fact that I had never hunted a vampire before. When I met the monster hunter, I was a security guard, a loser on minimum wage, who had gotten himself fired. That was then, I told myself. Now, the only thing that mattered was revenge. I would make the vampire pay for what it had done. First, I had to find the fiend. I paced the bleak rain-swept city into blind rage for hour after hour. I broke into derelict buildings and searched filthy alleyways and found nothing but dead ends. By dawn, I was no closer, and I knew by then that the vampire would be hidden away. It would be in a coffin somewhere to escape the light. To have any chance of finding it, I needed to wise up, to think. I recalled how the vampire had killed the monster hunter in its own act of revenge, after he had taken out one of its kin in a seedy bar. I would go there. It was miles away and I was beat, so I stuck out my arm to hail a taxi. 3 cabs with their light on drove straight past me. I did not know why. I wasn't wearing anything out of the ordinary, apart from maybe the fedora the monster hunter had given me just before he had died. But then I realized the reason none of them wanted me as a passenger. I was holding a wooden stake. Its tip was sharp, ideal for ending a vampire, and guaranteed to make cab drivers give me a wide berth. I put the stake under my coat, held it in place with one of my arms, while with the other I tried again to flag down a taxi. At last, one pulled over to the sidewalk, trying not to stab myself in the chin with the stake, and trying not to look weird while I was doing it. I got in. The cab driver did not want to take me all the way to the bar because of the reputation of the district that it was in. I did not blame him and ended up walking the last mile. Layers of graffiti covered the walls and cars were parked up on street corners with music blaring out. I stopped hiding the stake. Looking like a crazy was an insurance policy on these mean streets. I made it to the bar without being hassled. There were no windows and the door was closed. The place was a seedy enclave, a refuge for loners and sometimes creatures of the night. I wondered if the vampire that I was seeking might be in there. It would be safe from the light of day. And I knew from my previous visit that the bar sold plasma as well as cheap beer. The customer is always right no matter how disturbing their needs. One of the few useful things that I had learned when I was a security guard was how to pick locks, and the lock on the bar's door was as shoddy as the rest of the place. In less than a minute, I was inside. The only signs of life were the flies buzzing around the flickering strip lamp in the ceiling. The place stank as well, of stale sweat and old cigarette smoke. It looked like somebody had made a passing attempt at cleaning up after the night before. Chairs were upended on tables and broken glass had been swept up into a pile in one corner. And that was good for me. I could walk through the bar without stepping on any shards and broadcasting my presence. I headed for a back door which was propped open by a chair. As I came closer, I heard the sound of snoring. There was someone outside whose dreams were about to be rudely interrupted. I stepped over the chair and into a backyard that was littered with more broken glass and empty beer cans, mounds of cigarette butts and empty pizza boxes. A rat sat in one of the boxes, licking the base. It ignored me and I ignored it. I wanted to speak to the other vermin in the yard. The barman, who I recognized from the last time that I was there, was fast asleep in a deck chair. A cigarette hung out of his open mouth and drool dripped from his chin. I kicked his leg. He sat up with a grunt and looked at me with bloodshot eyes. "You are going to tell me," I growled, "where to find a particular vampire. Is real pale or real ugly, favors black for his attire, and he attacked an associate of mine." "Oh yeah," he growled back. "I know the bloodsucker you're talking about. He was in here bragging about what he had done. But there's no way I can betray him. My life would not be worth living." I put the tip of the wooden stake against his chest. "Now," I said, "I know that if I impale you with this, you won't crumble into dust because you're not one of the undead. But I imagine that it will hurt real bad and likely prove fatal. You don't need to worry about no vampires, mister. You need to worry about me." He gulped, his Adam's apple moving inside his scrawny neck. "Okay," he said. "The dude with the fangs that you're looking for likes to sleep at the mortician's on the corner, 2 blocks along from here. It's a big old building with a hearse parked in front. Can't miss it." "Sounds like a real charming place," I said. "Does the mortician know that he's got vampires on the premises?" "He sure does," the barman replied. "He's got plenty of spare coffins, and the vampires pay him to watch over them while they're asleep. Protect them from scum like you." He spat these last words out. Fresh anger flared inside me, but I held it in. He was human garbage, but my sole aim was to take out the vampire. The rest of the filth inhabiting the city could rot. "Mighty grateful," I drawled and left him scowling. The mortician's was easy to locate. The buildings around it were run-down homes. Paint was peeling off of the walls. Windows were boarded up in some. Rusting cars sat in the overgrown yards of others. The mortician's was constructed of stone and had a faded grandeur. The hearse parked in front of it looked like it belonged to a different age, one where men wore top hats and a lady showing an ankle was considered risque. It sat in its own grounds and there was no way to sneak up on it, so I decided to walk straight up to the front door. I tried the handle. Locked, but it was also easy to pick, so I went right on in. My heart was beating fast as I looked around. There were chairs lined up against a wall, a table with a bowl of wilting flowers in it, and 2 doors leading off from what I took to be a reception area. I mentally tossed a coin and opened the door on the right. I led into a wide and low-ceilinged room. A candle flickered in one corner, illuminating half a dozen coffins resting on stands. I tried the lid of the nearest one. It slid away easily to reveal the coffin empty. I took a breath and moved on to the rest. The next one was empty. I pushed away the lid of the 3rd coffin and my skin began to tingle. There was a body lying in the coffin. It was dressed in all black and its skin was drained of color. Its mouth was closed, but I knew that behind those pale lips there were fangs. My hands were shaking badly as I lifted the stake and placed its sharpened tip on the vampire's chest above where its undead heart would be. This hideous creature had destroyed the monster hunter, and now I would destroy it. But I could not do it. I could not push the stake into its heart. For all I wanted revenge, this felt like such a vicious thing to do. I closed my eyes, told myself that I had to strike. And then I heard a door creak and span around, to find myself face to face with an old man. The mortician it must have been. He was pointing a revolver at me and there was a cold smile on his liver-spotted face. "You have my sincere condolences," he said. "What for?" I managed to ask. "For your imminent death," he told me. My guts tightened. I had missed the chance to destroy the vampire and now I was about to get a bullet in the brain. The mortician's icy stare hardened as he added, "If sir would like to step this way, I will prepare you for your grave." He pointed the barrel at a connecting door. I dropped the stake and raised my hands and headed that way. I found myself in a room dominated by a narrow table and shelves stacked with dusty bottles full of dark liquids. At the head of the table there was a silver tray with scalpels, plastic tubes, and a surgical saw, the kind of equipment that a psychopath would need. The mortician laughed at the horrified expression on my face. "I would assure you that you won't feel a thing," he said, "but that would not be true. Now lie on the table so I can make a start." I stayed on my feet. "What are you going to do?" "There's no money in simply burying bodies anymore," he answered. "So I have diversified. I have my vampire guests, and I also have a thriving sideline in providing body parts to clinics. Eyes, kidneys, hearts, all the organs that they will buy for patients, willing to do anything to enhance their miserable, disease-riddled lives. I can make a few $1,000s from you, and afterwards the vampire can have your blood with the compliments of the house, which is quite enough talking. Get on your back, it's cutting time." My options were bleak. Fight back and die, or submit and be turned into spare parts. I was trying desperately to decide when the door burst open and a man strode in. He wore a pinstriped suit and carried a cane. "I am here for the vampire," he said. "Can either of you gentlemen tell me where it is?" In response, the mortician grabbed a scalpel and lunged at the dapper intruder, who neatly sidestepped the attack and chopped the mortician's neck with the side of his hand. The mortician crumpled to his knees and then fell forward, flat into his ugly face. He was unconscious. The man in the pinstripe suit turned to me and said in his clipped, precise tones, "Do we also have a problem?" "No," I told him. "I'm here for the vampire as well." The man in the pinstriped suit frowned. "In that case, we might have an issue after all." He took a sheet of paper out of his jacket pocket and showed it to me. There was a mugshot of the vampire on it with a $sign followed by 4 figures printed below. Once I had the chance to take this in, he continued, "I am the operative who has been assigned to hunt this monster down, and the fee is mine." "I understand," I told him. "I don't care about the money. All I want is revenge." A small smile flickered across his lips as he said, "Well, that's very noble of you, but every monster has its price in cold hard cash, and that is my priority. So what is it going to be? Do we fight for the right to impale?" I thought back to how I had been unable to finish the vampire off, hating myself for it, but knowing that it was the right thing to do. I said, "The vampire is through there." And then I left him to it. The monster hunter's death had been avenged, albeit by the hand of another, and yet all I felt was emptiness. I had been a failure when this had started, and I was still a failure. Alone and broke with no purpose in life anymore. As I had done before, I drifted, while the world happened around me. Everybody seemed to have somewhere to go to, somebody to speak to. Everyone except for me. Eventually, I found myself back at the rundown building which the monster hunter had used as his base. I went inside, threw the fedora onto the floor, and collapsed onto the battered sofa that sat in the center of the room. My eyes began to close, and I was so tired and on the verge of tears. The whirring sound of a fax machine made me sit up. The monster hunter had avoided modern technology because he did not trust it. He had pointed out that hackers were constantly on the virtual prowl, around emails and messaging apps, but that no one was looking out for faxes. They were old school and obsolete, unless you were a freelance operative being paid by the government to eliminate monsters. Despite my failure earlier, was this something that I could do? I wondered. And if people who sent the faxes had not realized the monster hunter was dead, could I take his place? With these questions weighing down on me, I dragged myself to my feet and went to see what was printed on the paper being dragged through the fax machine. 2 sheets of A4 ended up in the tray. The first one had a mugshot of a man with short, tidy hair wearing glasses. He looked like the least threatening person that I had ever seen. And yet the fee for his elimination was into the 5 figures. I gripped the paper tighter when I read that. If I could do this one job successfully, I would have more money than I had ever had in my life. I moved on from the dollars and turned to the next page where a last known address and its monster classification was given. I knew the address. It was a cemetery on the edge of the city, and the man in the mugshot was a zombie. My hands were shaking as I folded up the papers and put them in my pocket. I picked the fedora up and the equipment that I would need from a cabinet, and then took a deep breath. All I had to do was eliminate a zombie. How hard could it be? I kept telling myself that all the way to the graveyard. When I arrived, it was clear straight off where the zombie had emerged from. One of the plots was surrounded by a flimsy perimeter of tape, similar to that the police used at crime scenes. The earth in the plot was broken open and just the headstone remained intact. A scrawny man dressed in overalls was standing nearby, leaning on a shovel. I wandered over and said, "I'm working for the government. Can you tell me what happened?" He was chewing tobacco and worked it around his mouth before he replied. "Yeah, about dang time. I've been telling everybody something bad would happen, but no one ever listened to me. They never do. Dang fools." "Well, I'm here," I said patiently, "and I'm prepared to listen." He turned and pointed into the distance. "It's all because of that river. It broke its banks a few days ago after all the rain we've had, and the land in the graveyard was flooded. The river water seeped right down into the earth, right down into the graves. Now most times this would be pesky, but no big deal. But that's bad water in that river, you see. It's heavy with pollution discharged from the chemical plant about 2 miles upriver from here." "And what did the polluted water do here?" I asked, gesturing at the disturbed grave. A disgusting wad of tobacco landed on the ground close to my feet. He wiped the back of his hand across his mouth and continued chewing as he spoke. "Why, it done brought that young man back from the dead. I seen it with my own eyes, clawing its way out, no longer a human being but one of them zombies like they got in the games down at the arcade. It climbed right out and then staggered off. I had almost everything that I needed." "Just one more thing," I said. "Which way did the dead man go?" He pointed in a new direction. "That way, towards the highway, maybe looking to hitch a ride." I pity the poor fool that gives that bundle of decaying body parts a lift. I thanked him for his time and set off walking towards the highway. When I arrived, I saw that it was a long, bleak strip. There wasn't a truck in sight. Along the road, I could see a lone building, lights flickering on its roof. It spelled out diner. I headed that way. From the outside, the diner looked filthy. Its windows were covered in grease and water dripped from a broken gutter, and somebody was pushing open the door. Not someone, I realized with a jolt of adrenaline, but something. As the zombie shuffled inside, a little bell above the door rang. I followed. The diner's interior was foul. Its tables were covered in a red plastic that was cracking and peeling away. There were scraps of food on the floor and there were flies everywhere. They crawled over the tables and along the walls, and flew around the head of the latest customer, drawn in by the decay. The object of their attention, the zombie was shuffling towards the counter. A man wearing an apron that had been white decades ago had his back to the counter and was flipping patties on a hot plate. The zombie slapped a hand down onto the counter. "Hey, hold your horses there, fellow," the man in the apron said. He turned and asked, "All right, what can I get ya?" The zombie's voice when it answered was low and distorted. "Brains." The man in the apron shook his head as he replied, "We don't serve no brains. I can do you a burger with onions, fries, or a hot dog, but no brains." The zombie was not interested. Brains. Its voice rumbled like the prelude to a storm. Need brains. I decided to intervene. I took off the sawn-off that I had taken for the cabinet and tapped the zombie on the back with the barrel. How about you hurry it up a little, I said. Some of us haven't got all day. The zombie turned. I could still recognize the man in the glasses from the mugshot, the man that it had once been. Now its skin was gray and breaking open in places. I could see the flesh beneath and patches of the decay that was beginning to consume it. And I wondered how inbred ugly the regular customers at the diner must have been. I mean, the man in the apron hadn't batted an eyelid when he first saw the zombie, yet most people would have run screaming at the sight of its horrific face. A face that was leaning in towards me. Brains, it said, a glimmer of hope in its hideous tone. Not today, I replied and placed both barrels against its forehead. I knew that if the movies and TV series were right, I needed to destroy its own brain to end the thing. My finger moved to the trigger, but once again, I couldn't do it. This thing had once been a living and breathing person. The zombie's mouth opened, revealing gray teeth from which drool hung. Its fetid breath struck me, and I felt bile rising inside me and my limbs freezing as fear took over. And then it moved in closer. It was about to bite me and I could not move. Suddenly, there was a blur of movement behind the zombie. It was the man in the apron swinging a frying pan at the back of the zombie's head. He connected. The zombie groaned and turned away from me to see what had hurt it. I had my second chance and I took it. In the aftermath of the impact, matter flew everywhere. It was parts of the zombie's skull and its brain, I realized, as I wiped some off of my face. And it was not just me. It was all over the walls and the man in the apron. Part of the zombie's brain had even ended up on the hot plate and were beginning to sizzle. I think I've lost my appetite, I said and walked away. Back at base, there was a fax waiting for me. It had one word typed on it. Update. I wrote, zombie eliminated, requesting payment, and I sent the fax back. A few minutes later, I had the details that I needed. I took a shower to clean off the zombie remains and found a change of almost clean clothes from the pile that the monster hunter had left on the floor. I also found an ankle-length leather coat hanging in a closet. Must have been a spare for the one that the monster hunter wore. I tried it on for size and it fitted me perfectly. I smiled, put the fedora back on, and I went to go get paid. I had been told that the cash had been left in a briefcase in a locker at the train station. As tired and stressed commuters filed past behind me, I glanced in the briefcase and saw the stacks of banknotes. My heart soaring, I closed the locker and, looking as casual as I could, I walked away. There was no way that I could deposit that amount of money in a bank, so I went back to my base and I hid it in various places. And then I waited. Although I was now cash rich, I was hooked on monster hunting and wanted another assignment. As the hours passed and nothing came through on the fax machine, my mind had wandered. I thought about the chemical plant that was supposedly discharging substances into the river that could reanimate the dead. Was that really the case? I had wondered. I looked back at the fax machine. Still silent. So I got to my feet and put the fedora and coat on. It was time to get proactive and go see for myself what was really happening at the chemical plant. And maybe I would get lucky. Maybe there would be some monsters in the mix. I walked through the night, enjoying the sense of freedom that I felt now that I didn't have to worry about money. Soon, I was skirting the edge of the graveyard and following the course of the river. There was a rank smell rising from the water, but that was not that uncommon in rivers in built-up urban areas. I needed to get to the source, to the plant itself. It was a squat, sprawling concrete structure surrounded by a steel fence. Signs were placed on the fence warning of 24-hour surveillance and guard dogs. I knew from my own experiences as a security guard that this was a bluff. The reality was that somebody would make a half-hearted tour of the perimeter of the building once a night and then move on. I found a break in the fence and I slipped through. There was a door ahead of me. It had its own sign saying, "Fire door, keep closed at all times." The door was propped open with a plastic barrel, with the symbol for hazardous substances on its side. I stepped inside and found myself in a brightly lit open space. There were more of the barrels, some lying on their side. Dark liquid pooled on the floor in places, and in the distance, I could hear voices. I moved towards this, an adrenaline junkie in search of their next hit. At the far end of the space, a couple of people deep in conversation suddenly walked into view. I ducked down out of sight behind a stack of barrels and listened as the first one said, "These test subjects better be viable. I am getting it in the neck from management for all the rejects that we've had to throw on the river." His companion merely grunted in reply. They had reached a door with a panel next to it. The companion punched in a series of numbers and the door slid silently open. After they had gone through the door, it remained open. I crept forwards, slipped through, and crouched low to hide behind a steel cabinet. The men that I had followed were oblivious to me. They were walking along a row of beds, and each bed was occupied. If this had been a hospital ward, the scene before me could have been a couple of doctors doing the rounds. Only the patients in this building were strapped to their beds, and they were writhing and groaning. I recognized that sound from my encounter in the diner, and a cold chill ran down my spine. This wasn't a chemical plant. It was some kind of twisted zombie production line. The two men were making notes and shaking their heads. They didn't seem happy. Finally, with their inspection complete, the two men left the room. On the other side of the door, one of them tapped in a code and the door slid shut. I straightened up, and I moved over to the beds and the things being held prisoner. There were 5 of them in all in various stages of decay. The sickly sweet smell of rotting flesh was heavy in the air, and as each of them noticed me, they struggled harder against their restraints. These were made of thick leather and slotted into metal holders. For a moment, I considered trying to free them, but I dismissed that idea. These were no longer men. They were monsters who would attack and bite me and devour my brain given the slightest chance. I decided the best thing to do was to get out of there and alert the government by fax. I turned to leave, and as I did, an alarm began to howl and an intercom high on the wall of the room buzzed into life. "Attention. You are not authorized to be on this site and will be dealt with accordingly." I swore. The voice over the intercom went on. "You will now be a participant in our research program." "I will not," I yelled back, but I got no reply. Instead, the intercom cut out and the straps holding the zombies down were automatically released. I was trapped. A human subject for a test to see what 5 zombies would do to one helpless victim. I watched in horror as the zombies sat up. They moved slowly, as if trying to remember how to work their bodies. Their hands twitched and reached out, and they seemed to be struggling to focus. One zombie, which had made it to its feet, stumbled and fell into the one next to it. The zombie lashed out with its arm, and within seconds, both were snarling and trying to bite each other. The other zombies just sat there and watched blankly. It was clear this batch of zombies was a failure. Without warning, the door slid open and a man wearing a lab coat had walked into the room. He wore an expensive-looking suit underneath the coat. An entourage, dressed in security uniforms, followed, all carrying poles with plastic loops at the top. Careful to keep their distance, they snagged the zombies around the neck and dragged them out of the room. "Such a waste," the man in the lab coat said as he watched them go. "But we will try again, starting with you." "No way," I shot back. "You're not going to turn me into a zombie." "Oh, it's not your choice. You forfeited all your rights the moment you trespassed on my property. You'll never get away with this. Oh, I will. I make generous donations to political campaigns and employ a large number of local people at my other businesses. Money makes the world go round, and money makes the authorities look the other way. You are mine to do with as I choose." He laughed and walked out of the door. One of his entourage on the other side started to tap in the code to close the door. I had one chance to act. The long leather coat had deep pockets. They were ideal for storing equipment that a monster hunter might need, such as a wooden stake which I took out and threw towards the door. It landed on the floor in the gap before the door had a chance to close, holding it open, but not by enough for me to squeeze through. I ran at the door, shoulder barged it, and I was out. The entourage and the man in the lab coat were already gone, apart from the man who had been left to enter the code into the door. He looked at me in shock and then reached for a taser hanging from his belt, but he didn't make it. My fist connected with his face. I heard and felt bone breaking. His, not mine. He did not cry out. His legs gave way and he collapsed onto the floor, out for the count. I jumped over him and ran back through the space and the propped open door. When I arrived back at my base, I was coated with sweat and adrenaline was still pumping through my veins. I was a man on a mission. I was going to alert the government to what was happening at the plant, and then this evil operation would be taken out of business. The man in the lab coat and his lackeys would go to prison for a very long time. Justice would prevail. I went inside to find somebody waiting for me. He was wearing a pinstriped suit and held a cane. It was the monster hunter who had saved me from the mortician and eliminated the vampire. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He took a piece of paper out of his pocket and showed it to me. There was a mugshot on it. Of me. "I don't understand," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm terribly sorry, old chap. I've been assigned to eliminate you. But I'm not a monster." "Oh, the system says you are. And once you're in the system, there's only one way out." He lifted his cane and unscrewed a cap from the end, revealing a hideously sharp dagger. "I'll make this quick," he said. "No," I begged him. "I've uncovered a facility that is making zombies. The man who runs it thinks that he's above the law because he's rich. He's behind this as well, he must be. The system is corrupt, and you're being used by it to kill an innocent man." He stared at me, and then slowly put the cap back over his dagger. "I barely know you," he said, "but I believe that you're an honest person, a good person, and I've had my suspicions for some time about those who pay me to eliminate monsters. So I'm going to lie and tell them that I eliminated you and take the fee, and then maybe find a new career, maybe back home in England." He gestured towards the door with his cane and continued, "You should leave as well. They have eyes everywhere and there's a good chance they'll discover that I let you go. More monster hunters will come after you then, and they will not hesitate." I took a deep breath and walked out. It had started to rain and the city was cold and gray around me, a hostile, threatening place. I had been a monster hunter. Now I was a fugitive. Who wants better sex? And who wants to start having better sex immediately? Adam and Eve is offering 50% off just about any item, plus free shipping which includes rush processing. And more than that, Adam and Eve want to make your life easy. They offer discreet shipping as your privacy is their #1 concern. Whether you're trying to spice it up in the bedroom with your partner, or make some time just to relax by yourself, Adam and Eve is your go-to. Just go to adamandeve.com and select any one item, and make sure to enter offer code Mr. Creeps at checkout. This is an exclusive offer specific to this podcast, so be sure to use the code Mr. Creeps to get your 50% discount off any item, plus 100% free shipping, and get it fast with rush processing. Again, that's code Mr. Creeps at checkout. My friends weren't exactly enthusiastic about meeting me at a place called the Death Ridge Lodge. Even after I told them that Death Ridge was just the name of the shepherd who used to own the land. Truth was, I was more than a little nervous myself. I had been out of the country for 5 years and there had been calls and letters, but my friends and I hadn't seen each other in all that time. Would we still have the connection that we once did? Some of the changes that time had wrought were surprising, others less though. We had all expected my stubborn, brilliant friend Jennifer to be an attorney like her father, but in a story straight out of a cheesy Hallmark movie, she had married a guy from a tiny town in Kentucky and had 2 kids. Meanwhile, Ned, a loudmouth, extroverted redhead, had somehow ended up working from a lonely home office as a computer programmer. And then there was Zoe. She had been my crush since our sophomore year of college. It wasn't just her auburn hair or piercing green eyes. It was the care and honesty that she showed in everything she did. Before her, I had never met somebody who really listened, who really cared about other people without working their own angle. We had all expected great things for her, but in the end, she wound up like me, back up in our hometown, unsure about the future. But now that so much time had passed, would we even have anything in common anymore? As it turned out, I needn't have worried. Not even the wailing winter storm and unexpected power outages could dampen our good time. Ned, Zoe, Jennifer, and I gathered around a roaring flagstone fireplace, sharing our favorite scary stories and urban legends. It didn't matter that the howling wind made going outside deadly, or that snow would cut off the forest road to the outside world. We had warmth, food, booze, and our rediscovered friendship. We also had Lee. When we arrived, Lee explained to us that he was the off-season caretaker of Death Ridge Lodge and the surrounding cabins. During tourist season in the summer, the place was swarmed with hospitality workers, but from fall to spring, Lee mostly had the place to himself. When the blizzard hit, he had made a point of checking in on us. "The temperature's going down out there," he warned us that fateful night. "Visibility is almost 0. You kids wouldn't want to get lost out there tonight, or any other night." "Don't worry," Zoe smiled. "We have no intention of going outside in that." She pointed to the wind-driven snow that was rattling against the window panes. "It can't be that easy to get lost though, can it?" Ned, always the contrarian, asked. "I mean, we're on the side of a mountain. To go one way, you just go down, and to go the other way, you just go back up, right?" "It's not that simple," Lee grunted, pulling up a stool. "We're 100 miles from civilization out here, and if you can't recognize any landmarks, all them pine trees out there look the same. Even if you think you know where you're going, this mountain likes to play tricks. The gentle slope you walk down in fall might be dangerously steep in the spring. Boulders tumble, streams change course, and pathways disappear from one season to the next. There are dozens of trails crisscrossing this old mountain. 1800s logging roads, game trails, other pathways so old that it's impossible to tell who made them. Trust me, you lose your way out there, all you're gonna get is more and more lost, and then you'll start to panic. And at that point, if hypothermia and hunger and the bears don't get ya, old man Deathridge and his dogs will." "Deathridge? Dogs?" Zoe and Jennifer asked at once. "How much do you four know about Deathridge Lodge?" "Not much," I admitted. "I was looking for a place where my old friends and I could meet up over the holidays. The place looked cozy, had hiking and skiing and good reviews. Besides, back then the weather forecast said that we would have a clear weekend." Lee nodded as if that was what he had expected. "It's an odd place with an odd history. Just after the Revolutionary War, a man named Jebediah Deathrich showed up here and started construction on a cabin. He said that the mountain had called to him, and that he'd seen it in a dream, and that Patrick Henry had gifted him the entire mountainside in exchange for services rendered during the war. There was plenty of land back then, and grants were being handed out like candy, so nobody called him on it. Besides, folks had wanted farmland, not the slope of a mountain. They all thought that Jeb Deathrich was crazy, but he carved a life out of these hills, swearing that he and the land were one flesh. Jeb and his sons felled forests, dragged out the stumps and planted orchards. They set up secret garden patches back in the woods, raised chickens, cows, and a flock of sheep. For a while, things were good. The old man stared into the fire. "If you young people get bored with all this history, just say so." "Well, it's not like we've got anything better to do now, do we?" Ned scoffed. "No, please go on, it's interesting." Zoe reassured Lee. Ned rolled his eyes. "Well, the years rolled by. Jeb died and passed his land on to his son and grandson, who went on living the same way that he had. Meanwhile, towns were building up around the mountain. The more they expanded, the more folks demanded proof that the mountain really belonged to the Deathriches. By the end of the Civil War, that's to say, Jeb's great-grandson's time, nobody cared about yellowed papers and ancient claims. Folks wanted the mountain developed and kept suing until they found a judge who agreed with them. Amos Deathrich got a few acres and the rest went to mining and logging companies. But taking advantage of the Deathriches' land was no easy task. You see, the Deathriches refused to accept the court's decision. They kept living in their hidden shacks on the mountainside and made life tough for the companies who, from their point of view, were trespassing on their property. Every day there were downed trees on the road, supplies burnt, animals missing. It went on for decades, all the way into the 1900s. And while nobody had been hurt in Amos Deathrich's little guerrilla war, it was costing those companies more than the mountain was even worth. They had to put a stop to it. The first sign of trouble was when Alice Deathrich, Amos's wife from back east, stopped coming into town to sell her honey and fruit preserves. A few days later, Amos was found in the middle of a dirt logging road, surrounded by his 3 mastiffs. They had all been shot to bits. 10 years later, some trappers found Alice and the kids in a shallow grave. They said it looked like they had died badly. "So who did it?" Jennifer asked. "Well, nobody can prove nothing about nothing, but a group of flashy out-of-towners rode in on the last train from Chicago that night and left in the morning. Folks in town said they saw lantern lights going up the logging road and gunfire in the hollers." Lee stared thoughtfully into the fireplace. "In a way, though, I guess you could say the Deathriches won out in the end. The mountain never yielded enough timber or coal to justify the expense. The companies that had fought so hard over the mountain, and even killed to keep it, all went bankrupt a few years after. This place was practically abandoned till the national parks craze took off in the 1950s. Some clever investors bought it off the bank for pennies. They built the cabins and lodge that we're sitting in today." "But what does that all have to do with Old Man Deathrich and his dogs?" "Well, the mountain wasn't completely left alone after all them companies had closed down. The local men came up here to hunt. Grandmothers collected fruit from the Deathriches' woodland orchards. And the teenagers, well, they came up here to do what teenagers do. But over the years, rumors began to trickle down about strange sightings in these woods. Some folks got to thinking that maybe Amos Deathrich wasn't really dead, or if he was still around somehow." "You mean like a ghost?" I ventured. "You call it what you want." Lee prodded at the dying embers. "I'm just telling you how I had heard it. and you wouldn't believe some of the tales the folks in town have about this mountain. Like old Bruce Higgins, who came back from deer hunting, all bitten and tore up, with his rifle missing. Said he had been chased down the mountain by 3 snarling shepherd dogs, just like those huge mastiffs found shot beside Amos. Miss Nellie Price said she saw the old man himself stalking through the trees with a 100-year-old hunting rifle and a sack of dead rabbits slung over his shoulder. Lee rambled on, and Jennifer tried to hide a smile. "I'm sorry," she chuckled. "It's just my dad was a hunter and he used to see things in the woods too, usually after his 5th beer. And my great-aunt Mildred was convinced she was hearing whispers in her walls, until my mother got rid of the bird's nest in her chimney. The bird song had been echoing in the pipes, sounded like real human voices. My point is, there's a snowball effect with stories like these. They live rent-free in the back of people's minds, and when they see something that they can't explain, they just keep on adding to them." "I'm not saying that you're wrong," Lee grumbled. "I've never seen old man Amos myself, and I've lived here all my life. But I will say that there's something off about this mountain. Maybe it goes all the way back to Jeb Deathrich or even before that. Otherwise, how can you account for all the disappearances? Like the 4 high schoolers who went camping up here in a dare back in the 1970s. Nothing was left of them but a trampled down tent and the soggy ashes of their fire." "Wasn't there an investigation?" Zoe asked. "Oh, sure there was. The police conducted that the girls had run away from home. Then when Terry Bannister and his 9-year-old son didn't come back from their hiking trip, they blamed wolves. When a local artist's car was found along a logging road with spikes in the tires and the driver's side door hanging off its hinges, they called it an abandoned vehicle. They just towed it back into town and didn't even look for her. Don't you see where I'm going with this? Ever since the logging and mining dried up, tourism is the only thing keeping those little towns afloat. The ghost of Amos Deathrich and his 3 hounds makes for a fine local legend. But if the summer crowd ever found out about the real horrible crimes that happened up in this mountain every year, it'd be the death of the whole industry." "I call BS," Ned laughed. "This sounds an awful lot like a scary story that locals use to scare us wide-eyed out-of-towners with. Am I right? Call it what you want, but I wouldn't go outside until the storm passes if I were you." He pulled on his boots and wrapped himself in his winter gear, so weathered and worn that it was all the same uniform tone of grayish-brown. "You kids got everything you need." We nodded and he waved to us as he trudged out of the door. "Stay safe out there," I called out too late. The only response was the rattling of the screen door and the howling of the wind, if it was the wind. I thought of the savage jaws of enormous mastiffs and I shuddered. We all slept beside the fireplace that night. Everyone had their own excuse. Ned claimed the rooms were too cold. Zoe said she wanted to have a slumber party. Jennifer had already fallen asleep in her chair. But I knew our real reason for keeping close to each other was that Lee's tale had unnerved all of us more than we would have liked to admit. We craved the primal comforts of fire, warmth, and companionship. Before going to sleep, I dared to take a look out of the frozen window, but all I could see was blackness. Too cold even for a ghost, I told myself with a chuckle, before stirring the fire and curling up in one of the lodge's thick blankets. My dreams were haunted by worm-eaten faces in shallow graves and shadowy figures on desolate mountain paths. I woke before anybody else in the morning. I had always loved the peace of being awake while others slept. I took my time making my coffee and examining what the storm had done to the mountainside. The trees were bent, icy spikes stabbing into an ominous gray sky. At least a foot of snow covered the lodge patio. Frigid air blasted my face as I heaved open the sliding glass door and stepped out into the winter wonderland. As beautiful as it was, something more than the cold was bothering me. It took me a moment to fully realize what it was. There were no footprints leading to the cabin where Lee was staying. True, maybe the snow had filled them in, but no smoke rose from the chimney either. Where had he gone? I was leaning out over the railing for a better view when I heard a low growl from behind me. I wasn't alone on the patio. Half-frozen drool hung from the mastiff's gaping jaws. Its hazel eyes burned with fury. Another identical dog growled behind me. They were trying to cut off my escape. I bolted for the door and slid it shut just before a mouth as large as my face smashed into the glass, cracking it. The enormous dog lunged again, widening the spiderweb pattern on the glass. Barks and howls chilled my blood. My friends were waking, but not fast enough. Just a few more minutes, Zoe mumbled while I shook her. Holy crap, Ned screamed, pointing at the mastiff slamming itself into the glass. Get to the kitchen. Jennifer grabbed the fire poker and waved us through before slamming the kitchen's heavy wooden door. From outside, barks, snarls, and shattering glass. Heavy canine steps across the hardwood. A long, mournful howl echoed through the cabin, and 3 sets of paws began scratching at the door. I wondered if the enormous dogs outside were calling to their master. Oh my god, what the heck is going on? Ned jabbed his finger at my chest like all of this was my fault. Is this some kind of sick joke? Jennifer demanded. How should I know? I shouted back at Ned. I know what's going on, Zoe murmured. Amos Deathrich. We're on his mountain and those are his dogs. Just how Lee described them. Ghost dogs? Ned rolled his eyes. Come on. That mastiff out there just smashed its head against a sliding glass door until it broke. Would you call that normal dog behavior? Listen. Jennifer put her ear to the wooden door as it shook beneath the dog's attack. They're not just scratching at the door. They're gnawing on it. Those aren't ordinary dogs, and speaking of Lee, where is he? I don't think he made it back last night. I thought of the smokeless chimney and the untrammeled snow. The kind the old caretaker was probably lying beneath it with his throat ripped out. Amos had come for him at last. The door rattled on its hinges. We gotta find a way out of here. That door is not gonna last much longer, Jennifer whispered, unlatching the small window above the sink. Oh sure, great plan. Ned rolled his eyes. Let's run through the woods in sub-zero temperatures in our pajamas. What could possibly go wrong? What do you suggest then? Jennifer challenged. As much as I hated to admit it, Ned was right. Last night's fire was dead and its warmth was fading fast. If Amos and his dogs didn't kill us, the cold would. Zoe was already struggling to keep herself from trembling. While the rest of us argued, she had been scrounging for supplies. She had found a few cobwebby soup cans, 3 dull kitchen knives, an almost empty box of matches, and a trap door. It took all of our strength to heave it open, and even then the light didn't reach whatever waited at the bottom. One thing, however, was clear: we were running out of time. The timbers on the kitchen door splintered, treating us to a view of slobbering fangs. The rusty window frame screeched as Jennifer flung it open. I looked down at her bare feet. Jen, going out there is death. I will not wait to die in some dark hole. We gotta make a run for it. Of course, I suddenly remembered that Jennifer had claustrophobia. That cellar must have looked like her worst nightmare. I know you're scared and we all are, but nothing. I'm going. Jennifer wiped away her tears with her pajama sleeve and leapt down into the snow. Behind us, the dogs had almost broken through. Ned, Zoe, and I sprinted for the trapdoor and slammed it shut behind us. The mastiffs sniffed around and dug at the floor over our heads, but only for a moment. A horrifically human whistle split the silent winter air outside, followed by a cruel command. "Sicker, boys." First came barks and then snarls, and Jennifer began to scream. Maybe it was a blessing that we couldn't see what was happening out among the frozen trees. I pressed my fists against my ears and shut my eyes tight against the awful ripping and gnawing, barely audible over Jennifer's screams. When it was finally over, the chattering of our teeth felt like the only noise left in the world. I had forgotten how much the cold could physically hurt. With trembling fingers, Zoe struck a match. We were in a low-ceiling dirt cellar. Decades of cobwebs hung like hideous curtains above us, and generations of junk had been scattered carelessly across the uneven ground. We rummaged through it by matchlight, looking for something, anything that we could use. "Pay dirt," Ned shouted. He had found a canvas sack full of moth-eaten wool blankets, leather boots, and parkas beneath a heap of snowshoes. We bundled up immediately, grateful for the warmth, but there was little else of value in the heaped rubbish around us, and we were running out of matches. "This is weird," Zoe nudged me. She had found an old wooden chest full of century-old dresses, leather bags and belts, and a tiny silver locket. The cellar ceiling groaned with heavy footsteps. Zoe instinctively pocketed the locket and grabbed my arm. "Now where'd the rest of you run off to?" The voice above us was the same one that had sicked the mastiffs on Jennifer. There was something antiquated, gravelly, and wild about it. Something that made me think of the unsettling tale of the Deathrich clan. "Amos," Zoe mouthed, pointing to the far side of the cellar. The crumbling stone wall faded into blackness, but as I crawled silently closer, I could see what lay above. A coal chute, an escape. The footsteps overhead left the kitchen. I imagined they were heading upstairs to check the bedrooms. We had shoes and a way of keeping warm, even if they were filthy and they fit badly. If we were going to try to slip out through the coal chute, it was now or never. Ned's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist as I struggled to push open the rusted shoe cover. "Are you crazy?" he hissed. "Didn't you hear what happened to Jen out there?" "Jen had a point too," I whispered. "Whoever or whatever is up there is bound to check down here eventually. Do you want to be down here when that happens?" "I'll take my chances." Ned had found an ice axe in the heaps of junk and held it with a white-knuckle grip. I realized that my loudmouth childhood friend was even more frightened than Zoe and I. To my surprise, Zoe's cold hand slid into mine. "Are you ready?" she asked. I nodded. "Come on, Ned, come with us. There won't be another chance." "No way, I'm staying right here." Ned shook his head. The last I saw of him was his pale, stunned face, watching us scramble out into the winter sun. Zoe and I trudged through the snow, afraid to look back, afraid of what might be following. We kept our eyes away from the red patches and the white where Jennifer had met her end, aiming instead for a suspicious trail of footprints that led from the woods up to Deathrich Lodge, one large human and 3 dogs. "Ghosts don't leave footprints, do they?" Zoe murmured. I shook my head, wondering where this insane day would lead us. Zoe and I had barely entered the silence of the pine forest when we heard the gunshot, the boom of a shotgun blast. Ned had been found. Zoe grabbed my arm and I could feel her warmth through our improvised blanket coats. It was what I had dreamed of when I had planned this vacation, alone with Zoe holding her close in the winter woods. But now my dream had turned into a nightmare. The triumphant baying of the dogs and a man's maniac laughter, carried to us by the wind, confirmed what we already feared. Our friend was dead. For a long minute we just held each other, listening to our thundering heartbeats, a reminder that we were still alive. But for how long? The footprints in the snow seemed to follow a sort of game trail, just like the ones Lee said the Deathriches had used. A small creek ran alongside it. My feet were exhausted from slogging through the high snow, but we had to put more distance between us and pursuit. Right around the time that I lost sensation in my feet, we rounded a corner and saw a slumped-over hut up ahead. The footprints that we had been following seemed to originate from there. I swallowed hard and looked back at the boulder-strewn mountainside behind us. "Hide up there," I told Zoe. "I'll see if it's safe." "I'll come with you. This is no time to be she began. "Listen, if it's not safe, we're both dead. This way, at least one of us makes it." "Are you sure?" "If we don't find warmth, food, and shelter, we're dead anyway. I've got to see what's in there, and if you..." Zoe shut me up with a strong hug. "Let me go instead. I want you to keep watch for me." I didn't like the idea at all, but I could see in Zoe's eyes that her mind was made up. She left me with an extra blanket and the other supplies that she had dug out of the cellar. I set up a vantage point behind a boulder where I could see without being seen, or so I hoped. Now that the sun was setting and my sweat began to cool, I found myself rethinking what I had said to Zoe. I had intentionally exaggerated when I told her that we would die without shelter, or at least I thought so at the time. But as the pine tree shadows reached out for us like long fingers and the temperature dropped, I wasn't so sure. I wondered if covering ourselves with dirt would keep us warm enough, or if I would even be able to light a fire with my shaking hands. I fiddled nervously with the first thing that I grabbed out of Zoe's blanket, that weird silver locket. I realized that it had a clasp. It was probably one of those necklaces that held pictures inside. Down below, Zoe was a tiny black shape on the sagging steps of the hut. She pushed open the creaking door. I was so concerned about what might come out of it that I had forgotten to pay attention to the path below. I suddenly sensed a presence just a few feet away. "You all right, son?" A voice muttered behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin before I recognized it. Lee. I could have laughed for joy. If anybody knew a safe way off of this mountain, it was him. "We were attacked. I know it sounds crazy, but I think Amos and his 3 dogs. Shh. I seen him on my way down here, but don't you worry. Everything's gonna be alright now. Where's the girl, is she?" "You mean Zoe? She's down there by the hut." "Good." Lee whistled and his voice changed. "Sicker boys." 3 huge mastiffs bounded down the path toward the hut, barking loudly, and Lee stepped backward. He held an ancient shotgun in his hands. Only then did I look down at the open heart-shaped locket that I held in my hands. The black and white photo on the right showed a kindly-looking woman named Alice Deathridge, but the photo on the left was captioned Amos Deathridge. The face it showed was a familiar one indeed. It was staring back at me from behind the barrel of a gun. "Amos." The dog circled the hut below, howling. Any minute now, they would corner Zoe. "Don't tell me you believe in ghosts. I thought you city folk were supposed to be smart. Try this on for size." Alice Deathridge survived the awful thing those flashy out-of-towners did to her. Maybe she had a baby a few months later. A feral kid who raised himself after she died from her lingering injuries 10 years later. Otherwise, who would have buried her for those trappers to find? And maybe later, that kid grew up and decided that he didn't want the family name to die with him. Maybe he kidnapped one of them girls that came up here in the 1970s and used to get himself an heir. Maybe that heir is standing here right now, pointing all Amos's rifle in the face of yet another trespasser. I lifted my hand slowly. Just don't hurt Zoe." "Hurt her? Oh no, I need her. I'm gonna breed myself an heir the same way that my father did, and raise him to carry on the fight till this mountain is ours again. After you 4 go missing, even the tourism people won't be able to cover it up anymore." Lee Deathridge's speech was cut short by the half-rotten log that slammed into the side of his head. Zoe hit him 2 or 3 more times, but I doubt the blows were necessary. Lee Deathrich had met the fate of his ancestors, but I could hear his dogs baying below from inside of the hut. "You alright?" Zoe asked. "How did you?" I wondered. That hut must be where he's been living. It was dim and filthy, but I saw a pile of rope right around the time that I heard those dogs charging down the trail. I tied it to the front doorknob and left it open just a crack, while I stood by the back door and waited for my moment. When those dogs charged in, I tugged the front door shut and slipped out the back. Deathrich's dogs are trapped in there for now. I remembered how quickly the 3 mastiffs had gnawed their way through the lodge's kitchen door and shuddered. But would they even pursue us without Lee Deathrich urging them on? We didn't wait around to find out. Night had fallen by the time that we reached Deathrich Lodge. It felt like years had passed since we had fled the cellar that morning. Too emotionally and physically exhausted to talk much, Zoe and I distracted ourselves with the simple task of survival. Building a fire, heating water, gathering blankets, reinforcing the doors in case the dogs or anything else came back. It had been the longest day of my life, and I ended it curled up with Zoe in front of the lodge fireplace. By morning, the snow had melted, and the unpaved, switchbacking road off of the Deathrich's mountain seemed just barely passable. Once we started driving, I realized just how much danger we were in. The back of my Corolla fishtailed around every turn, and twice the tires stuck in slushy mud and began to slide towards the cliffs beside us. When Zoe got out of the car to help me free it, I saw something that I still can't explain. Maybe it was just a hallucination brought on by stress, but I swear that I saw another Amos Deathrich look-alike watching us from the woods. Was the mountain really haunted? Even worse, did Lee Deathrich have a brother? When I looked again, they were gone. I didn't have any answer then, and I still don't. But I suggest you stay away from Deathrich Lodge. Life is scary when you quit your job and literally nobody noticed. Life is scary when you wink at your crush as you pass by her desk, only to realize that you have toilet paper stuck to your heel. Life is even scary when it's your first date and you really need to fart. Now we all deal with Sunday scaries, right? That oh crap, stressful, nervous, can't sleep, dread feelings that hit you on Sunday evenings when you think about work or school the next day, or life in general. Unfortunately, you can feel that same pit in your stomach any day of the week. Sunday Scary CBD gummies were made to defeat the crap life throws at us. These are the perfect CBD gummies for professionals on the grind, supermoms, students, party animals, regretful drunk texters, and everything in between. Now me personally, I don't relax very well. I've never been someone who can just sit down and chill out. I always feel like I need to be doing something, whether that is work-wise or at home. It's just hard to shut off my brain and chill. While that can be positive in some ways, it also makes me overthink and stress myself out. Sunday Scaries are vitamin-boosted CBD gummies that actually work, and they chill me out fast. Look, we all have the right to live scare-free, so whether you need to take the edge off, calm your racing mind, or sleep better, or just chill, take 2 CBD gummies every day to keep the scaries away. Let me save you with my 25% discount. Visit sundayscaries.com and use my promo code Mr. Creeps for your discount. That's sundayscaries.com, promo code Mr. Creeps for 25% off. Teddy and I had been working at Disneyland for years. The two of us had seen hundreds, if not thousands, of young cast members come and go, heading off to college or to better jobs and brighter futures. Meanwhile, the two of us stuck around and became a running joke to some of the younger employees, since we were never promoted to management. Most of the lower-level cast members were young, in their early 20s or late teens, and to them it was only a part-time gig. a way to make money for college or to pass a bit of time until their real lives and careers began. But Teddy and I were lifers, and some would say losers. Although I would never attach that label to myself willingly, I had heard it whispered enough times to know that it was what other people thought of us. We had both been there for nearly 2 decades and had worked on pretty much every single attraction, but had never been deemed responsible enough to be promoted to supervisor status. Over that time, I found out a lot of secrets about the place, some things that are known to the public, but also some revelations that aren't talked about anywhere. Did you know that cast members who work as mascots have to wear communal underwear? Yeah, that's right. They share the same underoos and they get washed in between uses, at least in theory. Who knows what weirdo came up with that idea? Or how about the fact that the skeletons on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride were originally constructed out of real bones? Despite the park's insistence that all of the bones were removed, a few still remain. Management lost track of which were real and which were fake, and they just left the real ones in there along with the imposters. But when you're up close, it's easy to tell them apart. The real ones are a little more yellow and they're heavier than the plaster ones. There are plenty of morbid secrets like that. People scatter the ashes of their deceased loved ones in the park so often that we actually have a not-so-subtle codename for it: White Powder Alert. The Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean are the most common places, but it's done all over, and who knows how often people get away with it without us noticing. Code 101 means a ride is temporarily shut down, while Code 5 or a protein spill means that somebody has vomited on a ride and it needs to be cleaned up. Those spills are often the cause of ride shutdowns, rather than mechanical issues. Oh, and if you hear yourself or somebody else being referred to as a treasured guest, it doesn't mean that you're a VIP. It's actually our code word for saying that you're being an a-hole. There are stories of ghosts, some told by people who never believed in such things before witnessing them in the park. The specter of Walt Disney himself had been seen at times, outside of Sleeping Beauty's castle just on the other side of the drawbridge. Or sometimes he's seen at night, just outside of his old apartment on Main Street, where occasionally you might smell a whiff of cigarette smoke, despite the fact that such things are banned inside of the park. Walt and his family had once lived there so they could spy on visitors and listen to their opinions about the park. They would eavesdrop on their conversations from their second-floor apartment, just above street level. George, a dead electrician, supposedly haunts the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, and every morning cast members must call out, "Good morning, George," at the start of the day. Otherwise, the ride will mysteriously have issues all day long. Unexpected shutdowns and other strange occurrences are commonplace if George isn't given his proper morning greeting. And have you heard about the animatronics in It's a Small World run all night long? Yep, those rumors are true too. In fact, quite a few of the lifelike robots stay in motion 24/7, even throughout the lockdowns and park shutdowns a couple of years back. If you ask management about this, they'll tell you it's because the attractions are cheaper to maintain this way. They break down less frequently if they're in constant motion. That's the excuse that we get anyways. But I've come to realize that there might be far more terrifying reasons for this. Something so disturbing and twisted that I wouldn't have thought it'd be possible if I hadn't witnessed it for myself. Teddy and I were on our lunch break when we found the storage room. We were looking for somewhere private since Teddy had brought a bit of homegrown greenery and his favorite piece of glassware that day. The park has miles and miles of tunnels crisscrossing underneath it, and Teddy and I had explored most of the labyrinth over our years of service. Like everything in the park, there was a stupid nickname for these underground tunnels. They had been dubbed utilidors by some management type in the distant past. Most of the cast members just called them the tunnels, and they were so vast that we often used golf carts to get from one end to the other. There were odd dead ends and some tunnels seemed to intentionally lead to nowhere. We were currently in one such useless utilidor when we noticed an odd-looking door which appeared to be at least a half-century old, if not more. It had a rusted placard hanging on its surface which read, "Obsolete animatronic storage." "Hey, didn't there used to be a vending machine here?" Teddy asked. "Who cares? Let's see if it's open." We've only got 20 minutes left," I said, looking at the time on my cell phone. The doorknob turned in my hand and the two of us went inside. I looked for a light switch on the wall to my right, but I didn't find one. It was pitch black and impossible to see anything. Using the flashlight on my cell, I cast a beam of light around the room, trying to see what kind of space we were currently in. There were people-shaped forms all around us, draped in tarps and tablecloths. The room was as long as a football field, but it was narrow, only about 15 feet across. "Creepy," Teddy said, taking the words right out of my mouth. Well, I guess it did say this was animatronic storage. It must be really old. He wandered away from the door and it clicked shut behind him. Something about that made me nervous, but I ignored the feeling. The door had been unlocked and that meant we would be able to get out again. But still, I reached for the doorknob to check it. My hand was about to touch the polished brass when Teddy called out, making me jump. "Whoa, check this out," he said, sounding excited. I left the door, turning around to see what he was looking at. He had his cell phone flashlight on now as well and was lifting up one of the tarps to look at what was underneath. "Man, this thing is freaky looking." He pulled the tarp all the way off and I saw what he meant. The thing hidden underneath was very creepy. It had the goateed face of a young man but the ears and nubby horns of a goat, looking far too real. Its lower half looked like it also belonged to a goat. The thing reminded me of a satyr, those drunken, lustful half-goat gods from Greek mythology. I tried to figure out why it was making me feel so uneasy, and I realized it was the eyes. They were too lifelike, far more real than the animatronics out in the park. And the look of the skin, the way that it reflected the light and everything about it. It looked like this was a real creature, or more likely a man who had been sewn to the body of a goat in a very thorough way, making the seams blend together perfectly. And Teddy was already moving on to the next one, looking under another tarp. He left me alone with this one and I looked back down at it as I let go of the cover and let it fall over his face again. Flinching backwards, I nearly screamed, as I could have sworn the eyes of the thing were looking up at me, just as I had dropped the tarp over its face again. My heart was beating fast now and I tried to tell myself that it was a trick of the light, or that the eyes had been looking up that way the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. "We need to go," I heard myself say, but Teddy wasn't listening. "Holy crap, this one's even more messed up. Dude, you gotta check this out." I opened my mouth to say, "No, let's get out of here," but the words caught in my throat. The satyr creature under the tarp was clearly moving now. Its head was still draped in the plastic sheet, but I could see it turning up to look at me, as if its gaze could penetrate through the tarp. "Dude, come check this out," Teddy was saying, pulling the next sheet off and dropping it to the floor. I saw what he was referring to, my eyes drawn to it despite my terror of the draped creature just in front of me. This one was tall, standing nearly 10 feet. It had one large eye instead of two. Man, whoever made these things were tripping on acid or something. Look at this, it looks like they jacked an eyeball from an elephant and stuffed it into some dude's forehead. I think they were trying to make a cyclops. I could barely hear him as now the thing in front of me wasn't the only figure in the room which was moving. To my left, the entire row of covered forms were beginning to stretch and turn as if waking up from a very long sleep. Some were tall and some were short like the satyr thing on my right, but all of them were alive. I realized that I was very cold all of a sudden. and I breathed out to see my breath steaming in the air. A compressor groaned to life and I saw a nearby vent cough out a frosty plume, as if something had been jammed or broken and was suddenly operating again. The temperature in the room began to plummet, and a second later I was freezing cold, the rushing air chilling the back of my neck. Finally, I was shocked out of my stupor and managed to get out a word. "Teddy," I croaked, but it was too late. The giant cyclops hand shot out and grabbed my friend by the throat. It lifted him up into the air while his legs kicked and his arms thrashed, trying to break its grip. He was choking and sputtering, flailing madly as he tried to free himself. The cyclops held firmly onto his throat, and I heard the sounds of cartilage and bones being crushed. His spine popped and his head bent back at an impossible angle, his skull lolling backwards like a broken Pez dispenser. And then the giant dropped him to the concrete floor of the room, and his phone clattered and turned over, casting half the room in darkness again. I backed away, feeling like I was moving in slow motion but unable to go any quicker. Reaching back for the doorknob, I felt like the tunnel had grown by 100 feet. It was further away than could be possible. I kept backing up, taking slow and quiet steps. The figures were moving toward me now. All of them were closing the gap and slowly walking in my direction. Their forms were covered and draped in bed sheets, tarps, and tablecloths, as if this place had been thrown together in a hurry, hastily constructed to house these possessed animatronics, or whatever these creatures were. Cold air was filling the room, making it even more difficult to move. My skin felt like it was being stabbed with pins and needles, the freezing wind going right through my summer clothing. There was a sound of tearing flesh and blood being spilled, and I looked to see several of the monsters were tearing the skin from Teddy's face, peeling it from the bones with some difficulty, like trying to open an underripe orange. The worst part is that it looked like he was still alive. He was opening his mouth and closing it like a fish out of water, his eyes wide open as if he would be screaming if he were capable of it. I tried to tear my eyes away from this, but I could not, and I found myself staring at him as they took the flesh from his face. I backed up hard into something and realized that it was the door. In the darkness, I felt for the doorknob behind me, but I couldn't find it. The creatures were still moving toward me, all of their faces covered by the sheets, except for the massive cyclops which had killed my friend. Its one huge eyeball was fixed on me, and it moved in lockstep with the other creatures, as if they had all shared one hive mind. As they approached, a few stepped on each other's coverings, tearing them away and revealing their hideous faces. I saw a woman's upper body sewn onto the legs of a deer, and a man with the hindquarters of a bull, their faces full of mute anger. My hand groped for the doorknob desperately, and after several long moments, it settled on the smooth brass. It was so cold, almost frozen. I turned around, expecting the doorknob to turn easily again, but this time it was stuck. I couldn't tell if it was locked or frozen solid, but either way, it wouldn't budge. Feeling like there would be icy hands around my throat at any second, I was too terrified to turn back around. I heard the sounds of shuffling feet moving closer, the icy wind blowing through my clothes and raising goosebumps on my skin. I began to pound against the door with my fists, banging on it as hard as I could as I screamed for help, pleading for somebody to save me. "Help! Open the door!" I yelled at the top of my lungs. The corridor that we had entered from was a dead end, rarely used by anyone. Of course, this door would be locked only from the inside, I thought to myself. Who would offer an escape to these animatronic demons? If they had ever been imbued with any form of failsafe, it was long out of commission and useless. These creatures had no mercy and no respect for human life. They wanted blood and fresh faces to create more of themselves, to raise an army of undead, robotic soldiers. Manic thoughts were racing through my head as I tried to think of another way out. There had to be something some other way. I turned around, hoping for some other exit to present itself, but instead I just saw hundreds of shrouded forms stepping closer until they were just a few feet away. A gurgling, wheezing sound could be heard from behind them, and I realized it was the labored breathing of Teddy slowly dying. If I didn't find a way out, it would be me next. With one desperate move, I kicked out towards the head of the nearest shrouded figure, the satyr. My foot connected with its face, and as it did, the entire crowd fell back a step, as if hurting one of them would hurt them all. I lashed out with another blow, punching it in the gut, and the crowd took another wounded step backwards. I used the newfound space to my advantage and took a short running start towards the door, kicking it hard with my boot. I connected squarely with the spot beside the doorknob. It rattled in the frame, but it didn't budge. Taking a quick look back over my shoulder, I saw the crowd of animatronic creatures were now coming at me again with renewed anger. They looked furious at me for attacking one of them and apparently injuring it. The satyr was thumped forward, its joints making creaking noises as it made its way toward me, its movements jerky and disorganized. I kicked the door again harder this time, using every ounce of force that I could muster. I heard something splinter and break, but still it didn't budge. Icy hands gripped my throat from behind, and I threw an elbow backwards to try to break free. It connected with whatever had grabbed a hold of me, but it didn't let go. Instead, its grip tightened, choking me and squeezing my throat until I couldn't breathe. I let out another strangled cry for help, but no sound came out this time. The grip on my windpipe was making it impossible to call out. My feet were going numb from the cold, which seemed to have intensified even more somehow. I hadn't thought it was possible to feel any colder, but realized whoever was controlling the temperature of this place was doing this on purpose. These things did not like the cold, and it put them into a state of hibernation. But for some reason, this place had been almost room temperature when we had entered, bringing these creatures back to life. With one more desperate effort, I lifted my leg and kicked it as hard as I could, my heel connecting with the door just beside the latch. Something shattered and broke loudly, and the door swung open on its hinges. The momentum brought me forward, and I found myself tumbling back into the corridor. Whatever had grabbed a hold of me from behind came with me, the icy hands frozen around my neck. As I landed, the thing's fingers broke off like icicles, shattering on impact. The shrouded creature was writhing on the floor, looking as if it wanted to get up to chase me but wasn't quite capable of it yet. It was still too cold. I stumbled to my feet and ran from there, not really thinking about my mistake until I was far away from that spot. When it occurred to me what I had done, it was too late. I had let those things out. I had opened the door, freeing them, and I had allowed the warm air inside so they could come back to life and escape. I was too terrified to stay in the park. I went home immediately without saying a word to anyone, and then called my boss and told him that I was sick with the stomach flu. I apologized, saying that I had been throwing up in the bathroom and didn't want to cause a code 5 while on stage. He told me that that was okay since he knew that I was a dedicated employee, a trusted cast member who had been with the park for years, but he did ask if I had seen Teddy. I had to lie and tell him no. I'm supposed to go back to work tomorrow for the first time since this all happened. The worst part about it is nobody has reported Teddy missing. His family isn't called to say anything either. It's almost like none of it ever happened, except I've got the marks around my neck, the bruises that prove I didn't imagine it. I just got a strange text message from Teddy's cell phone number. "See you at work tomorrow, buddy," it said, accompanied by a mouse emoji. Me and some other cast members have a big surprise for you. At the boat ramp around the corner from my apartment lies a white behemoth, sitting silent as a tomb. Moored to a dock which no longer connects to shore, she bobs up and down in the water, only disturbed by the wake of passing boats. Rust has begun to creep down each of her 140-foot-long sides, almost looking as though some unseen ocean monster had gouged into it with its claws, and no light ever emanates from her many windows and portholes. The cam has, in a way, become part of my town's landscape for the last 2 decades and change, ever since her previous owners failed to pay the mooring fees for it, and it was seized both by the local government and the U.S. Marshals Service for separate reasons. There have been rumors of everything from drugs to botched scientific experiments taking place on board during her history. She originally was moored closer to downtown, but a few years ago she was moved to her new home and has sat there ever since. It was thanks to those rumors that one day while sitting on the couch playing video games with my 2 friends, Darren and Zeke, that the plan was hatched. We had taken a small break and Zeke stood up to grab a beer from the fridge. You know, I always wondered what exactly happened with that ship to make something which was once so beautiful and grand just, get abandoned and forgotten about. I twisted around on the couch to see him looking out of my kitchen window. I knew exactly what he was referring to. Yeah, dude, your guess is as good as mine, man, I answered. Now get back here and help us beat these putzes. There was a moment's pause and I heard him walk back over. For the next few hours, there was no mention of the ship as we slogged our way through deathmatch after deathmatch. I honestly thought the whole thing had been dropped. That was until we had wrapped up things for the night and my friends got ready to head home. You know what? Darren asked as he slipped on his jacket. For a change of pace, we should have a bit of adventure. Get out of the house instead of wasting ourselves away on the couch. Zeke and I exchanged glances with each other and then shrugged. Well, what do you got in mind? I asked him. The second the question left my lips, I knew I shouldn't have taken the bait, as an extremely mischievous smile spread across his face. Why don't we sneak on board the cam on Friday night? Finally see for ourselves what she looks like on the inside. I felt a pang of surprise shoot through me. Zeke was always the one suggesting wild and slightly dangerous things for us to do. But to hear Darren, who usually seemed a bit antsy about breaking the rules, volunteer something of this nature to do, frankly shocked me. Dude, you serious? Zeke asked him. He nodded. Seriously, with everybody celebrating Easter with their families, the boat dock will be pretty much empty on Saturday night. I'm sick of just doing the same stuff over and over. Sick of playing it safe. I say we go a bit buck wild. He cast a hopeful look our way. For a second, my mind remained blank and then it clicked. Maggie. His girlfriend of 3 years had recently broken up with him for another man. And to say that he hadn't taken it well would be like calling the Chernobyl meltdown a small accident. He had changed since then, becoming a bit darker and more willing to bend the rules. He gave us both a hopeful look. What about it? Zeke immediately laughed. Dude, heck yes, you're speaking my language now. I became aware that both of them were now looking at me. What do you say, Adrian? Darren asked me. You in? For a moment, I considered politely declining, making up some excuse about being busy this weekend. Trapezing around a pretty much abandoned and possibly dangerous ship, one which it was common knowledge was often used by the homeless as a shelter during the storms, was not exactly my idea of a fun time. But then I caved. I knew Darren was only doing this as a way to keep his mind off of his breakup, and if I left him alone with Zeke, without anybody to keep things from getting too out of hand, God only knew where things would end up. Sure, why not? I said. Immediately, both of my friends broke into soft cheers, slapping me on the shoulders and the back. For a few more minutes, we discussed exactly how it would go. Zeke's parents owned an old motorboat from the early 60s, and where their dock was just up the estuary from the cam, we would use it, motoring down and tying up on the far side of the ship so we could climb aboard, quickly check it out, and leave. Later that night, I lay awake in bed, staring up at the white popcorn-style ceiling of my bedroom. What exactly did I just get myself into? I wondered. Shaking my head, I turned over on my side and drifted off into a rather restful and dreamless sleep. I had no idea that it would be one of the last good nights of sleep that I would ever have. The next day and a half passed by in a blur. Before I knew it, it was late Saturday afternoon. As much as I was admittedly a little tense about what we were about to do, I still wasn't going to back out. However, I did stop by Empire Mercantile to pick up a few items that I wanted for the trip before heading to Zeke's parents' house. As I drove through the quickly emptying streets, I craned down to look at the windshield on my Lincoln at the setting sun. It looked almost blood red, sinking below the horizon. For some reason, it made me shiver slightly. I shook my head, speaking aloud as I pulled into the driveway. "Get a grip, Adrian. Knock that superstitious crap off. There's nothing ominous about a red setting sun." Pushing the feeling away, I got out and passed around my purchases to the others. Each of us now had a pair of thick, tear-resistant and waterproof gloves, and a small but powerful flashlight. "What are the gloves for?" Zeke asked as we walked down the backyard to the dock. I raised an eyebrow at him. "Have you seen how much rust is all over that ship? You want to cut yourself on a piece of rusty metal and risk getting tetanus or something." A look of realization passed over his face as my words had registered. "Oh," was all that he said, and then went silent. The three of us strode down the dock and climbed down into the 18-foot wooden boat. And a second later, the big black and silver Mercury 1000 outboard roared to life. "Here, man," Zeke said, offering me the wheel. "You're the best of the three of us at piloting a boat. I don't want to piss off my folks by hitting anything." I rolled my eyes slightly, but sat down in the seat, and after the stern and bow lines had been cast off, nudged the throttle forward slightly. Flicking on the running lights, we pulled away from the dock and began our journey down to the cam. Everyone was silent on the journey, though whether the silence was from excitement or apprehension, I couldn't tell. I gazed ahead of me, looking around as I allowed the 60-year-old motor to open up to full throttle. The last remnants of daylight were just barely visible over the edge of the dunes which separated the river from the Pacific Ocean. It honestly is a bit eerie out here when everybody else has gone home for the night, I thought as we passed by the channel marker buoy. All I could hear was the slap of the water against the boat's hull, the drone of the outboard, and occasionally a seagull cry overhead. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling the rather calming smell of the sea spray in the air, along with the mud flats which had begun rising from the water with the arrival of low tide. The slight sense of peace was shattered by Darren's voice behind me. "There, to port." My eyes snapped open and I glanced off to my left. He was right. I could clearly see the white paint standing out a good bit in the gathering darkness. Slowing the boat, I searched for someplace safe for us to tie up alongside of her. Darren realized what I was looking for. "Adrian, there's a boarding ladder on her side." Large obvious wooden steps set into the hull led up the starboard side of the ship from the waterline. I nodded. "Hey, nice catch, man," I said, looking back to see a smile of accomplishment adorning his face. Slowing the boat down even further, I swung it around and approached the ladder. Zeke climbed past me and over the windshield onto the bow area, picking up the curled bow line to help tie the boat up. I put the boat into neutral and let it coast the final few feet to the side. "Careful, bro," I called out softly as I saw my friend was preparing to step off the boat and onto the ladder. "Hey, don't worry, dude, I got this," he called back confidently, and with a last, cocky smile, he hopped from the boat and onto the ladder, causing a slight spike in anxiety to shoot through me. I watched him climb quickly up the ladder, reaching the railing and lifting himself over it. A moment later, I saw the bow line tighten and his face appeared at the railing again. "Hey, stern line, Dar," he called, and after a few attempts at throwing the line, with varying degrees of success, the boat was successfully tied up. I killed the engine as Darren climbed up the ladder, allowing the silence to overtake the estuary again. For a moment, I stood at the gunwale of the boat, my hand on the first wooden handhold, and wondered again what we were getting ourselves into. A little bit too late to back out now, though. Sighing slightly, I tightened my gloved hands on the purchase and I climbed up. A moment later, I hoisted myself over the rusty railing and finally was aboard, looking around at what I had seen from my apartment window for years. I could immediately tell that the converted ferry in her glory days had once been both extremely beautiful and extremely luxurious. The wood below my feet, now weathered with time, must have cost a pretty penny to install when the ship had been built back in 1938, and it gave off an air of sophistication. Well, sophistication once, now ruin, I thought. Turning on my flashlight, I looked around to see where the other two had gotten off to. A flash of motion caught my eye from the stern section. I thought that I spied Zeke disappearing around a corner, where I knew from my walks down to the boat ramp lay the outside stairs to the upper decks. Hurrying after, I rounded the corner and felt a small wave of confusion wash over me. The stern deck was completely deserted, with no sign of life in sight. That's honestly freaking impossible. I know that I saw somebody walk around the corner here. As I stared, debating whether to climb the steps or walk onto the port side of the lower walkway, a voice came from behind me, causing me to almost jump out of my skin. "Adrian!" I whirled around, my flashlight beam smacking right into the faces of my two friends. Zeke raised his hand to block the beam. "Hey, lower your light, you trying to blind us or something?" he hissed. After a moment, I lowered it, looking intently at them. "What?" Darren finally asked as the silence morphed into an uncomfortable one. "Did you two just dash around the entire outer section to get behind me or something?" I asked. I saw the two exchange a look. "Dude, what are you talking about?" Darren asked. I was about to answer when Zeke interrupted me. There's the stairs leading to the upper deck," he whispered, and then without waiting for either of us to respond, began climbing them. "Come on," he called back down to us. After giving me a last look, Darren followed. Still feeling perplexed at how sure I had been in seeing somebody round the corner, and now wanting to be alone, I hurried up the creaking metal steps after them. The first door, which looked to lead to a once snazzy lounge area, was locked, and so we moved on. As we walked up to the starboard door to the bridge, I again looked around. The only sound that I could hear now, which had started as I climbed the steps, was the humming and banging coming from the lumber mill across the estuary. I heard the scream of a saw filter across the water, in the dark, and on what I had to admit was already a slightly eerie vessel. I didn't like how it almost sounded like a woman screaming. Finally, we all stood in front of the door to the bridge. Darren looked at us. "Well, here goes nothing," he said, and then reached out and gripped the handle in one gloved hand. To our surprise, the door opened, and after an exchange of looks, the three of us slipped inside and closed the door. I shone the flashlight around. The ship never got an update in her equipment, that's for sure. The newer monitors that I could see looked to be at least from the mid to late 90s, if not earlier. Aside from them, what looked to be all our old gauges and levers remained, all covered in rust. A large wooden helm sat close up to the front windows, which looked out onto the bow of the ship and the darkness beyond. Darren stepped forward and pressed a few buttons on one of the monitors. "Well, the ship has no power turned on," he reported. "Oh, really? I wouldn't have guessed that. Thanks for the heads up. Sarah states the obvious a lot," Zeke said sarcastically. "Hey, screw you, bro. I'm just trying to check things out," Darren hissed back. But I didn't hear what retort he received. My eyes were drawn to a rather large wooden table in the back corner of the bridge. Walking over to it, I saw in the flashlight's beam that old sailing charts littered the desktop, along with a red, closed book. Shooting a quick look around, I reached out and flipped it open, finding that it was the ship's log. As I heard the other two move around and to the door connecting the bridge to the upper lounge area, I read. Many of the more recent logs came from the very early 2000s. Most just seemed to detail their final voyage from South America up here to the Pacific Northwest. Simply mundane notes. However, one entry from late October of 2002 caught my eye. October 23rd, 2002. We've made it all the way from Panama, halfway up the California coast. The ship is running well, and the small handful of crew we've hired to bring her up to Portland tells me everything seems in working order. With luck, we'll reach Oregon by the first few weeks of November, barring one or two moorings to resupply and refuel. However, I must make mention of one thing. Manuel, the gentleman that I purchased the cam from, told me to keep an eye out and ear out for anything unusual. When he told me this, I wasn't sure of what he meant. Perhaps a broken prop mount or a bearing that he refused to repair in the engine. However, as I've spent a lot of time on my own in areas of this ship, as my wife for some reason refuses to venture to certain rooms, the woman, as much as I love her, is far too superstitious, and the stories we were told about the ship's, well, colorful history sure didn't help. I've come to hear, well, I'm proudly just hearing things. Ships, especially ones as old as the cam, always creak and make strange sounds. And yet, what in the heck kind of machine sounds like a person whispering, or somebody walking about when no one is? I'm unsure of what to make of it, but decided to keep log of them in my private journal. Anyways, we should make it to homeport safely. We'll log again soon. I raised an eyebrow. Whispering, moving about. For a moment, the image of the person that I swore that I had seen flashed through my mind. A small chill ran up my spine, and for a moment it almost felt like I was being watched. But I shook it away. "Adrian, there are no such things as ghosts or anything. Get a grip, dude," I whispered. I looked up, seeing my friends had advanced into the upper lounge and shining their lights on the hideously outdated furniture. Before I joined them, I decided to flip the page and quickly see what the next log read. However, as I flipped the page, I saw only a blank page. Inspecting closer, I saw small torn edges of paper near the inner edge of the log. Strange. Page has been torn out. For some reason, it gave me pause, but I shrugged it away and closed the logbook. Leaving it where it was, I moved from the bridge into the lounge. I had been right in my initial assessment. Whoever had owned the ship last had gotten rid of what today would still look like beautiful and timeless furniture from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and instead replaced it with those god-awful designs which had been the focal point of the 80s and 90s. I didn't want to keep looking at the tacky swirls and almost nauseating colors, and so I looked around, spying another staircase, this one leading down to the lower deck. "Hey guys, come on, let's head down." I quickly checked my watch. The glow-in-the-dark face showed that it was just after 9 at night. "We're only going to stay another 15 minutes or so," I told myself, and then led the way down the steps. The lower level looked as though somebody had retrofitted it into a dining room of some kind. It looked as though the previous owners had had the goal of turning the ship into a floating cruise ship or restaurant, and it looks like they went broke attempting to do so. "Dude, this looks lame," I heard Darren mutter behind me. I looked at him. I mean, we always heard all the creepy stories about the ship over the years. All the stories about the messed up things that happened aboard her since her early days. All the tales about the drugs and experiments and murders, and we finally come aboard, what? We find out that it was nothing more than some rich lady's attempt to join the restaurant business. He kicked at a wooden booth. "This blows," he suddenly yelled. "This blows a blue whale. It blows so much." And with that, he leaned against the booth, his body seeming to sag from some unseen weight. I could tell that he had been filling his head with the idea of exploring the ship for a while, using it as a mental block to not think about his girlfriend leaving him. And now that he was confronted with the reality, it was all starting to crash down around him. I stepped forward and put a hand on his shoulder. "You know, the stories that we heard were far too good, or should I say bad, to be true, man. That's how urban legends start. Somebody takes something, blows it way out of proportion, and after a long game of telephone, it barely has any resemblance to the truth." He looked up at me, his eyes, which earlier that night had been twinkling with excitement for the adventure, now simply seemed empty. Slowly he nodded and then he sighed. "Well, I think I'm about ready to get out of here. What about you?" I let out a relieved sigh that I hadn't known I had been holding in. The truth was, as much as I knew it was just a ship, the whole abandoned angle, combined with the weird log entry, had made me feel a little uneasy. "Yeah, I'm ready as well." I turned. "Zeke, you ready to leave?" I called, but I received no answer. "Zeke," I repeated, my voice sounding somehow echoing and muted at the same time, as it bounced off of the degrading wood and furniture. I still got no response. Darren let out a slightly annoyed snort of air, his realization having soured his mood more than a bit. Where the heck did he get off to? He grumbled and then raised his voice a little. "Hey Zeke, get your butt out of here or we're leaving you to swim home." I turned back to him. "Shh," I hissed, even though I saw nobody through the windows on land, and it was likely our voices wouldn't be heard. I wasn't taking any chances, but still our friend didn't answer. I began to feel the uneasy feeling return in spades. The interior of the ship almost seemed as if, like a light bulb being flicked on, to have instantly taken on a new atmosphere from the simply abandoned one that had held the entire time we had been aboard. Now, with the lack of response from our friend, it had taken on an almost palpable sense of foreboding. I shone my flashlight around, looking for anywhere possible that he could have gone to. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," I heard Darren groan. "What?" I whispered back and he pointed. Aiming the flashlight further into the room, I saw an open door which led to a metal staircase going down. Over the doorway, a plaque read, "Engine room and lower decks. Employees only beyond this point." I let out a groan of my own. Oh, of course he would go down there. For a moment, I debated shouting down the stairwell for Zeke to go screw himself, and then I shook my head. Like it or not, he was still my friend, and I wouldn't leave him. "Yeah, come on, let's go get him and get the heck out of here," I said to Darren and led the way to the door. The steps, metal-grated ones which had been painted and now fading white, led steeply down into the darkness, and I took them slowly, knowing with their age that they could give way at any moment. After a few nervous seconds, we stepped off of them into the bowels of the ship. Shining my flashlight around, I saw the corridor that it opened onto led in two directions, one towards the bow of the ship and another towards the stern, where the engine room had to be. My breathing came in slightly shallow. The area was giving off extremely eerie vibes. Darren sighed. "Why does this feel like a scene from a horror movie, where the lead characters are forced to split up?" he asked quietly. I gave him a nervous look and a chuckle. "I wish you hadn't said that," I admitted, and then I reached into my coat pocket for the last two items that I had bought from the hardware store. Look, like it or not, if we want to get out of here quick, we're gonna have to go and check out one area each to find Zeke. That doesn't mean I'm having us go unarmed though. Here, take this. I held out the medium-sized object to my friend who took it, flipping it open after a second to reveal a sharp steel blade. He looked at it and then at me. What, you thought I was gonna be stupid enough to come aboard this thing unarmed, especially with the homeless people we see come aboard? He nodded and then suddenly looked hard at me. Speaking of which, where exactly are they? Shouldn't we have run into at least one of them by now? Or is some sign of their having been here? That question slammed into me like a truck. I hadn't thought about it, but he was right. The entire time aboard, we hadn't seen a blanket, wrappers, or anything that would signal homeless people had been on board recently. The realization made the unsettling feeling beginning to bubble up in my gut increase, and I shook my head. I pointed towards the stern. Look, let's just find Zeke and get out of here. You quickly go and check the engine room, and I'm going to check the bow section, okay? We meet back here in 5 minutes regardless. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded, and then he turned away and moved toward the corridor. I took a deep breath and then turned and moved in the opposite direction. The corridor was tight and narrow, almost making me feel claustrophobic. My hand gripped the pocket knife tightly as my footsteps echoed off of the metal grating. At the end of the corridor, I saw 3 or 4 doors. The first 2 were locked when I tried them, the handles only slightly jiggling. The third wouldn't even jiggle. It was jammed up tight. The final door opened, the hinges giving off a loud creak which echoed down the corridor, almost a little too loudly. I entered the room, shining my light around. I had entered into some sort of cargo area. I could see crates stacked up against one wall, their wooden sides warped and rotted by moisture. Against a far wall was another desk, though this one much smaller and less grand than the one on the bridge, much older as well. It almost looked as to be as old as the ship itself. I crossed to it, stopping as I thought that I heard a creak behind me. Every muscle in my body tensed up and my grip on my knife grew slightly sweaty. I took a deep breath, feeling again as though I were being watched, and I finally spun around. No one was behind me. Everything aside from me was completely still, and all I could hear was the gentle lapping of waves against the hull outside. Giving a last, wary look to the gloomy corners of the room, I turned back to the small desk. Immediately, I saw a few things which just seemed off to me. The first was that strange symbols appeared to have been carved into the desk, ones that I had never seen before. Looking at them almost made my head feel dizzy, and so I focused away from them. The second thing which seemed to be off was a large chef's knife had been slammed into the wood. I reached out and attempted to pull it free, but it refused to budge, as if it had been fused with the desk over the decades. The third were the only 2 other objects on the table. 2 pieces of paper lay on the desk. The first looked extremely yellow with age, as if it were at least 60 or 70 years old. The second, to my surprise, looked like a page from the ship's logbook upstairs. I saw the tear marks along the left-hand side of it, the torn-out page. I shot another look around, knowing that I should immediately get back to Darren. I didn't want to leave the guy alone in here as much as I didn't want to be on my own any longer. And yet something compelled me to lean down and pick up the 2 sheets of paper. I angled my flashlight down and began to read. First the torn-out page log and then the yellowed page. As I read the log, I felt my pulse, which was already a little off, begin to rapidly speed up. My heart began to beat wildly in my chest, and I felt my mouth turn dry as cotton. Even though I never believed in any supernatural stuff, the words written on both pages filled me with an ever-increasing sense of horror and dread, the likes of which I had never felt before. "Oh my God," I whispered as I finished the last sentence. That was when I heard it. It came from farther forward in the storage room, close to where the V of the bow met. I felt all the blood drain out of my face and my eyes go wide, my breathing almost hitching in my chest. Every part of me wanted to scream at myself that I couldn't possibly be hearing what I was. Even now, I still can't but tell myself that, and yet I know what I heard. I heard a whisper. It was unintelligible, too soft and low to make out individual words, but it was without a doubt whispering. It sounded like the speaker was whispering extremely fast and under his breath. Dropping the papers, I slowly aimed my flashlight towards the bow, the beam shaking slightly in my grasp. For a moment, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. The beam almost seemed to reflect off and extremely well. The only word that I can use would be dense shadows, one which the light couldn't shoo away. And then the darkness began to spill out of its hidey hole, sliding towards me and engulfing everything it touched. Terror coursed through every fiber of my being as I watched it slowly consume the crates, moving towards me. The sight of it beginning to creep over the papers that I had dropped freed me from the trance-like state that I had fallen into, and I turned and bolted from the room, leaping over the metal divider that the hatch had been set into. "Darren!" I screamed as I sprinted down the corridor, my voice and footfalls smacking off the metal corridor like gunshots. "Darren, we need to get the heck out of here." As I approached the door leading to the stairs back up, I suddenly heard my friend scream from further down the corridor. "Adrian, help me!" I shot a glance back, seeing the almost living darkness begin to seep out of the room that I had come from. Making my decision, I sprinted down the corridor to the engine room. "Darren, where are you?" I screamed. "In here, I'm trapped," came his voice from just inside the hatch. I ducked my head and leapt through the hatch into the compartment. Huge, hulking diesel engines rose up on either side of me, but I didn't pay much attention to the details. I saw Darren sitting on his butt in the middle of the room. His foot had fallen through the metal grating, and he was attempting to free himself from the small hole that it had caused. In seconds, I was by his side. "I'll help you," I cried and then knelt down, beginning to pull at his leg. It gave leeway, slowly beginning to pull out. "We need to get out of here right now," I shouted as I saw his ankle emerge. But then I felt his leg go tense. I froze. It almost felt like all sound and air had been sucked out of the engine room. The silence was unearthly, and it almost seemed to be filled with a sense of malice. And then I saw Darren lift his light and aim it behind me. "Zeke?" he asked softly. Another huge shiver shot down my spine, and I slowly turned to look. Sure enough, Zeke stood at the other end of the engine room. He had his back to us, standing half in and half out of the shadows. I aimed my own light at him. As it passed over him, he almost seemed to wince at it. "Zeke?" I called out after a moment. I was about to call again when the sound made me freeze up, and I know that Darren had heard it as well, because I saw his face go pale as mine must have. The whisper that I had heard was back, and it was not alone. I couldn't tell how many there were, but it almost seemed like an entire group of people were rapidly whispering. Just like before, I couldn't tell what they were saying, but the sound made all the hair on my arms and legs stand up straight. And then my heart almost stopped as I saw shadows step out of the gloom around our friend. And I don't mean people draped in shadow. I mean literal shadows, shaped into the rough outline of people stepped from the dark. I saw them poking their heads out from behind machinery, from crawl spaces that a human couldn't possibly fit, from everywhere. There almost looked to be a dozen or so figures standing there just out of the range of our flashlight's beam. And now I could tell the whispering was coming from them. And keeping an eye on them, I reached down and began fumbling to free Darren's ankle again. I had just about gotten it free when a new sound began, and this one did make my heart stop. Zeke had begun whispering to himself. I couldn't tell what he was saying at first as he was facing away, but it was in an almost identical manner to the shadows, low and fast. I leaned forward slightly as I finally felt Darren's foot pull loose, and to this day I wish that it hadn't, because I finally understood what our friend was whispering. "We'll never leave, we'll never leave, we'll never leave, we'll never leave." The same 3 words he kept repeating over and over, almost like a mantra. And I realized with a growing sense of horror that all the shadows were whispering the same words. I almost wanted to clap my hands over my ears to block out the almost maddening sound. And then it all stopped. Like somebody had flicked off a television, the whispers midway through their horrible mantra had ceased. The silence returned. A more horrific and deadly silence than I had ever heard. The shadows didn't melt away, they stayed, staring at us in the unearthly stillness. And then Zeke spoke clearly in a voice that for some reason sounded just off. "We'll never leave," he said silently and quietly, and then turned to finally face us. I clapped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. My friend's normally bright green eyes were gone, and in their place, sheer blackness. It was as if a squid had squirted its ink into them, turning them completely black, irises and all. Equally as horrible was the grin which was plastered over his face. It wasn't one that I had ever seen a human being give. If you've ever seen that crappy horror film from a few years ago, Truth or Dare, the smile the being possessing the main characters gave its victims, that was the smile that he had on his face. And then he spoke again with that voice that sounded wrong, as if it weren't just him speaking but someone or something else. And the 4 words that he spoke did practically cause my heart to stop. "And you'll never leave." As the last word left his lips, the shadows which had stayed where they were this entire time began to move forward, towards us. I shot a terrified look at Darren, who was stumbling to his feet. He had an identical look of horror on his face. We locked eyes as the shadows began to move towards us quickly, and then we were dashing out of the engine room. The whispering returned almost deafeningly loud as we ran. It was joined by 2 more sounds, mine and Darren's screams. Behind us, I could feel the shadows pursuing us. They hadn't expected us to move so fast, and by the tone of the whispers, I could tell that they were mad about it. The 2 of us crashed into the stairwell, bolting up it. In the chaos, I dropped my flashlight and heard it bounce back down the stairs behind me. But I didn't stop to look, nor did I want to look back. God only knows what I might have seen if I had. We burst into the restaurant area, running for the closest door. For a moment, I was terrified that, like what happened before, a character's death in a horror movie, the door would be jammed. But after a few terrified seconds of fumbling with the lock, the door flew open, letting in the sea spray from outside. "Forget the boat, just jump," I shouted at Darren, feeling the shadows still behind us. Almost as one, we both took 2 running jumps. My right foot landed on top of the railing and I pushed off. For a moment, the dark world swirled around me, and then the freezing cold water enveloped me. For a few seconds, I feared that I would drown in the darkness, but then my head broke the surface. Sputtering out salt water, I immediately began swimming for the boat ramp, hearing the splashes of Darren beside me. After a few seconds, we reached the ramp, pulling ourselves onto the concrete and coughing, and after a minute, from Darren, sobbing. That horrific night was 2 weeks ago. Neither of us knew what we could possibly tell the police without seeming insane, and we couldn't explain what we were doing aboard without getting in trouble, and so both of us just went home. Zeke's parents called the police to report their missing son a day or so later. They found the boat still tied up to the cam. They searched throughout the ship. I heard they found the flashlight that I dropped, the bulb broken, but they found no trace of Zeke. I knew they wouldn't. I felt consumed with guilt for my friend's disappearance. I had the chance to tell them no when they asked about sneaking on board, and I didn't. No amount of booze can chase that fact away. I keep my kitchen blinds tightly shut now. I'm too terrified to look out of it. too terrified that I'll see those shadows staring at me from the windows of the cam. And I haven't had a decent night of sleep since then. I keep having reoccurring nightmares. Horrible nightmares of those shadows coming for us. Nightmares of my friend or whatever he had become, telling me in that horrible voice that we would never leave, before melting away to become a shadow himself. Nightmares of running down an endless maze of metal corridors, the whispering always following just behind me. But almost worse than that, I dream of those 2 papers that I found in the storage room. The yellow paper telling in detail, which I don't dare describe, all the evil, depraved acts that the second-to-last owners did aboard her. Acts which dealt with the occult, dealing with human sacrifice and more, and turning the ship itself into a sort of a conduit. For what, I don't know, but from what I saw, a conduit or doorway for things which are insatiable and beyond evil. And the final, brief log entry of the cam's previous owner. November 14th, 2002. I'm terrified. I don't know what to do. I found that horrific paper wedged in the back of the old desk down below, talking about truly evil things which Manuel and the others did in this ship over the decades since they bought it. All the death, occultism, and worse they performed, all in the name of creating some sort of doorway to somewhere else. The only word I can use to describe it is Hades itself. I was afraid when the first member of my crew went missing that they simply fell overboard or drowned. But when more and more simply vanished, how could I have known? How could I have known what had been done when I bought this ship? Something that I wanted to change our lives for the better. My wife and I are the last 2 left. We hear the whispers filtering up from down below every day and night. They drive us to the brink of insanity. And even worse, I've seen the shadows. The figures which watch us from every dark corner of the ship. My wife is not, and I'm thankful for that. I'm not even sure if we'll ever see shore again. I feel they have a similar fate in store for us as the rest of my crew. But we have a plan. We're aiming for the nearest part, and as soon as we dock, we're getting off. And I'm just letting the ship sit and rust away. No matter how much it costs to moor, let it sit and decay until it sinks. I'm not even sure if the evil which lives in the hull will go then, but I don't know what else to do. And to anyone who may read this log, anyone from the Coast Guard or anything for that matter, if we don't make it back and you find this while searching for us, please, for the love of God, heed my warning. Get off this ship while you still can. One Saturday night, when we were young and bored and felt invincible, my friends and I decided to play the staircase game. To play this game, you need a black staircase and at least 3 people. To win this game, you have to finish walking down all 5 staircases. There are only 4 rules. 1. Once you start to play the game, you can't quit. 2. You have to walk down the stairs backwards. 3. While you're on a staircase, you are not allowed to talk to anyone. 4. While you're walking down the staircase, never ever let go of your travel companion's hands. Simple, right? We thought so too. My best friend Margot was the one who ultimately convinced us to play. Left to our own devices, Jonathan and I would have spent our entire summer in front of the TV, content to stay there until our respective college orientations had started. As Margot put it, you would have just rewatched the same boring shows, played the same boring board games, and gossiped about these same boring people. Margot was the kind of person who was going places. She had her whole life mapped out, from her college major to her 10-year career goals. Frankly, she was a terrifying force of nature. For example, When we were 12 years old and still naively believed in Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy, our parents took us to see the mall Santa. Margot argued with Santa for 15 minutes straight about why the nice and naughty lists were unfair and didn't account for the nuance. Coward and beaten, he finally told her that he would take her feedback into account and create the neutral list. Margot and I had been best friends for nearly all of our lives. To anyone else looking in from the outside, our friendship was impossible. Margot was brilliant, passionate, and outspoken. She took so many AP classes that she set a new record at her school, and she always knew exactly what she wanted to do and how to do it. In comparison to her, I meandered through life in a perpetual daze. Standing next to Margot, I was so quiet that people sometimes forgot I even existed. My parents would gaze at us and shake their heads in puzzlement. While they do say that opposites attract, my dad once said weakly, at the end of the day, it didn't matter what other people thought. Our friendship rested on the solid bedrock that was our mutual love for all things horror and the paranormal. We exchanged online scary stories late at night instead of sleeping, watched new horror movies and TV shows together constantly, and frequented paranormal discussion forums in between our classes. Instead of clashing, we evened each other out. I would have never thought it would be possible for anyone to come between us, which brings me to Jonathan. He transferred to our high school at the start of senior year, a time when most friendships had already weathered countless adolescent storms and were set in stone. Everyone noticed him because he was tall, dark, and handsome, but he seemed arrogant and aloof. Instead of approaching anyone, he kept to himself and read books during lunchtime. One day we accidentally bumped into one another, sending his books flying. Stephen King, Paul Tremblay, Stephen Graham Jones, and Silvia Moreno Garcia. While I helped him pick them up, I asked him what his favorite Stephen King book was. And just like that, we became friends. It turned out that he wasn't arrogant at all, just incredibly shy. His friendship was the missing puzzle piece that completed Margot's and mine. His dry humor and dark jokes fit right in. And of course, he was wildly in love with Margot. How do I know that? Because she's drop-dead gorgeous. She had long brunette hair that she often tied into a French braid and had dark gray eyes. I saw the way that his face lit up and the glances he sent her way. Jonathan's voice interrupted my thoughts. Are we really going to do this? It would be so much less work to just lie on the couch all day. He brushed a hand through his dark curls and gave us that lopsided grin of his, the one that made my stomach do a flip. Margot had led us to the pantry in her enormous house. Shelves had grown with the weight of cans and jars, rice and pasta, and other food items stacked all the way up to the ceiling. If there was ever an earthquake, whoever stood in here would be buried alive under all that food. Of course we are, said Margot, and then she softened, looking at us pleadingly. Guys, I want an adventure. You know my parents. If they had their way, they would bundle me up in bubble wrap and lock me in a safe. Sadly, she was right. Mr. and Mrs. Auden were fiercely protective of Margot, and we suspected that protectiveness stemmed from her sister's death. Marianne had drowned in their pool while Mr. Auden was on a business call. They hadn't found her body until it was too late. Margot had only been 3 years old at the time, Marianne 5, so Margot didn't remember much about her. I wondered sometimes whether Margot tried so hard to be the best at everything, because she wanted to make up for the fact that her sister would never get to do anything. She led 2 lives, the life she wanted and the life her sister should have had. I know it's silly. Everyone else who's celebrating the end of our senior year are going on road trips or traveling abroad. All my parents are letting me do is sit on the couch. I can't even attend a pool party. She took a deep breath, her eyes shining with tears. I want to do this, and it would mean a lot to me if we did it together. Even if nothing happens, I don't know. Aren't you a little curious? Yes, of course I am, I said as I hugged her. Jonathan came over too, so we were all in one another's arms for a few seconds. Truth, I was curious about the staircase game. The first time that I had ever seen someone mention it was back in the late 2000s, and that post had been taken down, but not before Margot and I agreed that it sounded intriguing. A handful of other posts, on those paranormal discussion forums that we love so much, detailed users' experiences with the game. According to those posts, each of the 5 staircases would be 100 steps. The posts advised us to count the steps to make sure that we were on the right staircase because sometimes the game tried to trick you. Additionally, every staircase would be a different color. The first one was always black. Then the rest of these staircases would be red, gray, blue, white, in any order. Each staircase supposedly took you to a different dimension. But strangely, none of those posts described what happened after you went down the first staircase. But all of them did agree on one thing though. We should bring flashlights, food, and water with us. So, we were in the pantry. You might be wondering why we took this game so seriously. As I've said, Margot and I loved scary things. Together, we tried nearly all the weird stuff you've read online. We trespassed on abandoned asylums, visited haunted houses, and slept at cemeteries overnight. But our specialty, what we did the most in our free time, was playing supernatural games. We played the elevator game, Light as a Feather, Suara, the corner game, Daruma-san, and more. We had never been able to play the staircase game before because it had been just the two of us. Over the past few years, as we had dabbled in these games, my belief in the paranormal had faded to a pale imitation of what it once was, like a fire slowly dying out into embers. Nothing had ever happened to us, not once. I wasn't sure if Margot still believed in the paranormal either, but still, it was a fun hobby. This would be Jonathan's first time doing anything like this. Senior year had been too busy for Margot and me to get up to our normal shenanigans. SAT prep classes, the SATs, college applications, homecoming preparations, and the time-honored tradition of playing a senior prank had occupied all of our free time. I tried not to think about the fact that Margot and Jonathan would both be at Stanford in the fall. Margot majoring in econ and Jonathan in biology. Margot had considered going to Yale until her parents made noises about moving to New Haven with her. Meanwhile, the only place that accepted me was our local community college. Don't get me wrong, I'm not against attending community college, just this specific one. Everyone at our high school, and I do mean everyone, joked about how bad it was. I still hadn't told my friends where I was going. The disappointment on my parents' faces was bad enough. I said, if we're doing this, let's get started. Maybe we'll be back in time to check out that new Korean show trending on Netflix. Okay, said Margot. With one foot, she shoved the heavy black backpack with all their supplies towards Jonathan, who picked it up as if it weighed nothing. Let's head over to the basement stairs. A few years ago, someone had slapped black paint all over the basement stairs. Okay, I admit it. That someone was Margot and I, back when we had first heard that you needed a black staircase to play the staircase game. Her parents had been furious. We stood in the basement stairs, gazing down into the darkness. Personally, I wasn't a fan of the dark, and basements have always seemed creepy to me. I knew that it was a childish fear, the kind that you're supposed to outgrow, but that didn't really help. It just made me feel stupid for having a nightlight in my bedroom. Well, said Margot, it's now or never. She held out her hands to mine. Wait, said Jonathan, suddenly serious. If this game is real, then I should walk down first, in front of you guys. Just as I was about to tell Jonathan that the staircase game probably wasn't real, I saw the vulnerability on Margot's face. That expression answered my question as to whether or not Margot still believed in the paranormal. Unlike me, she had more to lose if it didn't actually exist. Why do over 4 in 10 Americans believe in the existence of supernatural beings? Because they do exist. Or maybe because we all have cognitive biases, patternicity, pareidolia, a form of aphenia, and confirmation bias. In other words, we make connections in meaningless data or between unrelated events, and we interpret information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. Of course, I knew why Margot continued to believe in the paranormal. Marianne. It's a human impulse to try to make sense of a senseless tragedy, to dissect it endlessly so that you can figure out what exactly happened and why. If you admit that there is no fate, no purpose or order to anything in this world, then everything bad that has happened to you so far means nothing. The death of a loved one, an abusive relationship, bullying from classmates or colleagues. It's pure chance that you survived. Some people like Margot had a hard time coping with that. We linked our hands. Jonathan went first, then Margot, and then myself. Any last words? Jonathan joked. None of us said anything. I didn't know what Margot was thinking about, but I stared down into the darkness and my eyes strained to make out any shapes or movement. Let's do this, said Margot finally, with her usual certainty. And we walked down the first staircase together. I watched the light from the doorway vanish as the darkness pressed down on us. In a matter of seconds, it was so dark that I could no longer see these steps that I had already walked past. I kept imagining monsters in the darkness. Monsters with gleaming yellow eyes who waited impatiently for us to descend further down the stairs. My hands sweated in Margot's grip and I longed to discreetly wipe it off of my shorts. Unfortunately, per the rules of the game, I couldn't let go yet. I took a quick moment to be devoutly thankful that it wasn't Jonathan's hands in mine. We walked and walked. It was hard to tell how far we had gone, especially since walking backwards down these steps disoriented me. Yet I still felt that we should have reached the end of the staircase by now. Even though that I wasn't familiar with this basement, common sense said that an object couldn't be bigger on the inside than it was on the outside, i.e. the TARDIS is a lie. I chanced to glance over my shoulder to see how far we still had to go, and nearly fell over in shock. Instead of the darkness that I expected to see, there was a bright light below us right where the staircase ended. I swerved alarmingly towards what was probably a steep drop. My fingers brushed the air unable to find the railing that was supposed to be there. I caught my balance at the last second and heard Margot gasp behind me. I had almost brought her down with me. A perfect metaphor for our friendship. The words, "I'm sorry," were actually on the tip of my tongue, just as these stupid rules came back to me at the last second. Instead of saying anything in the darkness, I simply squeezed Margot's hand in apology. She squeezed mine back. I began counting the steps as we went down. I should have done that from the start, but I hadn't thought that the staircase game was real. Even now, I wasn't completely convinced. I don't think anyone would have bet, aside from Margot, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Is a longer than normal staircase and a bright light at the end of it enough to shatter years of conviction about the way that the world works. But as we drew closer to the light, I did start to believe that the game was real. The light showed us the details of our surroundings, and I could see that we were most definitely not in a basement anymore. I heard our footsteps and dripping water echo in the darkness. I had the impression that we were in some giant hollow cave. Air currents brushed my face. Weirdly, I even heard birds chirping, although why they were awake in the darkness, I had no idea. By the time that the staircase ended, I counted 57 steps. That seemed about right, since I hadn't started counting from the beginning. We went through a doorway and stood around blinking these spots from our eyes, trying to adjust to the sudden contrast from darkness to bright light. Bright sunlight. That didn't make any sense. Yet as my vision cleared, I realized that we stood outside in the middle of a vast desert. Shining golden sand surrounded almost everything. The exception was a long black road stretching ahead of us. That road gleamed under the sun like some sleeping obsidian snake, and set along the road at equidistant intervals from each other, suspended in the air without any visible support, floated the doors. There were doors of all kinds and sizes. Some seemed like normal wooden doors, only painted in eye-watering shades from neon pink to a blinding yellow. Some were large enough for a Boeing 747 to fly through, others so tiny that a mouse could pass only. A handful of them were made of the oddest materials, from stone to glass to what seemed like steel. The only thing all the doors had in common was their bronze doorknobs. Those attached to stone doors looked really out of place. I turned to the black road. Sand dunes blocked portions of it from view and the heat was so intense that the very air shimmered. From what I could make out, the road ended in another door. Great. Even though I was afraid, confused, and overwhelmingly anxious, part of me, the part that had never stopped believing in the paranormal, rejoiced. Finally, something had happened to us. Something that couldn't be easily explained away by natural causes. Probably, maybe. "This can't be real," whispered Jonathan. He let the backpack drop to his feet and stared around wildly. The blood had drained from his face, leaving his dark skin pale. "This isn't possible," Margot said. "Don't you see?" She was transported with a kind of savage joy. It took me aback because that was the expression you expected to see on some unhinged religious leader's face as he preached to his flock about the end of days. "It's real. The staircase game is real." She laughed wildly. If I had heard that laugh while in the dark, I would have been afraid. "Okay," I said, made uneasy. "It's real." I turned to search behind us for the staircase that had brought us here, and saw nothing but more desert. The door to the staircase had disappeared. Jesus Christ, the staircase game was real. "It's gone," said Jonathan, voicing my thoughts. Margot didn't appear to hear us. She strode forward and literally left us in the dust. Jonathan and I stayed in confusion, and then we ran after her. I could hear the cans clinking around in Jonathan's backpack. The heat was so intense that I was sweating even in my tank top and shorts. "Alright, either I just ate the worst pot brownie of my life," Jonathan said, panting, "or I'm having a psychotic break from reality and I'm imagining all of this." I couldn't respond because I had to use all of my breath for running. I wasn't used to running on hilly terrain and the road hurt my feet. I was wearing thin-soled shoes. I leaned down to examine the road and realized that it wasn't smooth. Black obsidian stones comprised it, similar to a cobblestone road. By the time we had finally caught up with Margot, a stitch burned in my side and I sounded like I was close to death. I felt close to death. "Slow down," I wheezed. I wanted to curl up in the fetal position, but Margot just kept on marching forward, forcing us to match her pace. "We can't," said Margot impatiently. She wasn't looking at us but straight ahead. "Don't you remember the post by Pharaoh's 7921? No. We only have a certain amount of time per floor. If we aren't quick enough, the next staircase will disappear and we'll be trapped here." Fresh adrenaline shot through my veins as I thought about being trapped in this weird desert. Now that Margot had mentioned it, I did remember Pharaoh's post and was annoyed at myself for forgetting. He hadn't specified exactly how long we had to find the next staircase, but he had been very clear that we needed to find it as soon as possible. "You don't want to be there after the staircase disappears," he had written. Margot's urgency instantly made total sense. As we trudged along, passing around the water bottle that we had brought, I waited for something terrifying to happen, but nothing did. The road was strange and the different sized doors were kind of creepy, but otherwise, it was just a desert devoid of any life. Eventually, as incredible as it may sound to you, I became bored. I guess it's true that humans can get used to anything. The heat remained relentless and I began to daydream about going to a nice, cool, air-conditioned mall. I imagined sitting at the food court directly under a vent with a giant smoothie in my hands. I was so lost in this daydream that when Jonathan tapped my shoulder, I flinched back as if he had hit me. "Sorry," he said, "but do you hear that?" Actually, yes. Now that I was paying attention, I heard the strangest noise. We glanced back and saw that all the doors behind us rattled and vibrated, as if something was trying to get through them. By then, we were nearly at the road's end, and we could see that the road led to a red wooden door. "Run," said Margot, her calm tone at odds with the fear in her eyes. We took off in a sprint. I hardly felt the heat anymore or these stones on the road that jabbed my feet. What stitch in my side. I was suddenly sure that I could run for hours. It's amazing what fear does. Along the stretch of road that we hadn't crossed yet, the doors there began to rattle as well. The sound of knocking and meaty thuds filled the air. The doors trembled and shivered as if things on the other side were ramming their way through. The second to last door, right next to the red one that was our destination, began to buckle under the weight of whatever was pushing it. As I watched, it splintered in half. "Go!" I screamed. Margot reached the door first. She slapped at the doorknob trying to open it and then rammed the door with her shoulder. Jonathan pushed his way forward and simply turned the doorknob counterclockwise. We all piled through the door as it opened, our hands clutching at each other. As before, Jonathan was first and I was last. Because I was last, and facing the still open door, I saw what broke through the door closest to us. Splinters flew through the air as the door finally gave way under the tremendous force battering it down. I saw them walk towards us as we backed down the staircase. They were beautiful, with shining white skin and hair. No, they were horrifying. Their faces were the faces of praying mantises. They opened their mouths to scream at us and I saw two sets of jaws, both filled with sharp teeth made for rending and tearing flesh, and too big for their triangular faces. And then they were heart-stoppingly lovely again, with liquid, doe-like eyes. I blinked, reeling from all the different images. I looked yet again, and saw that their corpse, pale bodies had been starved to thinness. I could count every single rib. They staggered towards us and held out their hands, beseeching. My mind began to buckle under the strain of trying to make sense of them. Their appearances flickered back and forth, lovely to ugly, monstrous to beautiful, over and over again. I somehow knew that if I didn't stop looking at them, I would go insane. But even with that knowledge, I couldn't tear my gaze away. My eyes burned, as if the very sight of them was cooking my eyeballs in their sockets. The last thing I saw before the red door slammed shut on us, leaving us in the blessed darkness, was that they had the arms and legs of giant spiders. They lunged at us and the hooks on those limbs scratched frantically at the closed door. The sound of the angry buzzing faded the further down that we walked. All three of us panted raggedly from our flight and from residual terror. We couldn't speak to one another though, not on these steps. I wanted to tell Margot and Jonathan that we had made a terrible mistake in starting a game that we couldn't quit. I wanted to say that I was worried we wouldn't all make it out alive. 4 more staircases to go, I thought, and I was afraid. As we walked down the second staircase, that same darkness full of lively bird songs surrounded us again. The bird songs sounded even more wildly out of place than before. I wanted badly to talk about what I had just seen, the shapes that had been so beautiful and horrible at the same time. But I couldn't say anything aloud while on the stairs, not without breaking one of the rules of the staircase game. So, to distract myself, I counted off the steps. It should have reassured me that the only thing I could hear was our ragged breathing. Instead, I kept thinking about the claws scratching at the door. Would we have enough time to run if they broke the door down? All too soon, we arrived at the end of the staircase. Jonathan pulled open the door ahead and we stepped out, onto a moonlit beach. We stood at the edge of a vast ocean. Moonlight turned the waves black and they lapped at us, stealing the sand from under our feet. A salty wind swept over us, though instead of bringing the briny smell that I expected, it brought something sweet and metallic instead. Wait, a horrible thought crossed my mind, one provoked by the familiarity of that scent. I bent down to inspect the ocean more closely, and instantly knew that we did not stand in water. "Now can we talk about what's going on?" asked Jonathan. "I need to throw up," I replied, and stumbled away from the sea of red around us. There were tall cliffs set further back on the beach. They reminded me of the white cliffs of Dover, not just because of their beauty but because of the sense of history they held. These cliffs had stood here on the beach for 500 billion years already, and they would continue to do so for another 500 billion years, no matter what else happened. Staring at those cliffs, I somehow knew that great and terrible wars had been fought here. The blood of slain armies had stained the ocean red, transforming it into what it is now. After emptying my stomach of everything I had eaten for lunch, breakfast, and dinner from last night, I walked back just in time to see Margot and Jonathan arguing fiercely, practically shouting in each other's faces. "You need to get a grip," snapped Margot, as if Jonathan was a recalcitrant toddler. "We don't have time for your hysterics. I'm sorry, I didn't tell you more about the game in advance, but we have to focus on finding the next staircase before we're stuck here." "It's more than that, Margot. What else aren't you telling us about this game?" I instinctively did what I always do, act as the peacemaker between Margot and whoever she was arguing with. "Hey, stop fighting. We're all freaking out here. Let's take a deep breath and step back." As usual, everyone ignored me. Margot looked right past me at Jonathan and said frostily, "I've told you everything I know. Winning the game is how we get back home. So, can we get on with this?" Jonathan gave her a disgusted look. "You love this. You love the fact that we're trapped in some kind of horror movie right now. You don't actually give a crap about going home. If it was up to you, we would stay here forever." Jonathan turned away and waded deeper into the sea. I hurried after him. "Jonathan, wait, where are you going?" "There's a door over there. It must lead to the next staircase, right?" said Jonathan bitterly, pointing at a seemingly empty patch of darkness. The waves hid what he pointed at, yet when I kept my eyes trained there, in between one wave and the next, I saw the gray door. It was half submerged, only the very top of it visible, but then it was gone again, obscured from view. I had no idea how Jonathan had even managed to spot it in the first place. The tide pulled me further away from the safety of the beach. Jonathan was tall enough that the water, or rather blood, only hit his thighs. Meanwhile, I was already chest deep in it. If I wanted to keep moving forward, I would have to swim, which I really didn't want to do. I imagined ducking my head under all that thick blood and being completely surrounded by it, feeling it pressed against my face like something alive. I took one tiny step further in and stopped. Against all logic, the blood felt warm against my skin instead of cold. That was better though, wasn't it? How much worse would it be to have to swim in cold or cooling blood? "We've wasted enough time," said Margot, coming up to stand beside me. "You know we're standing in, blood, right?" She dove in without a reply or any hesitation, though I saw her grimace as it washed over her. I don't think I can do this, I thought. But they were already more than 20 feet ahead of me. Apparently, I was the only one who had a problem diving into a literal sea of red. I took another tiny step forward, and this time, a wave lifted me right up off my feet and bowled me over. The current curled around me and tugged me forward like an impatient child. I swam, doing my best to not think about what I was swimming in. It was weirdly similar to swimming in water, so I concentrated on moving forward, slicing my arms through the blood and paddling my feet, and I tried not to dwell on the taste of iron in my mouth. I really didn't want to get left behind. Something brushed my ankle. Seaweed. I scoffed to myself. What could live in a sea of blood? But then again, technically none of this was possible. The post had said these staircases took us to different dimensions. What if the very laws of nature differed from dimension to dimension? What if these staircases took us to a place so different from our own world that the air itself was toxic to us, or that gravity tripled and crushed us all into a pulp? Preoccupied with my thoughts, I hardly noticed when something brushed my feet again, and then what was unmistakably a hand closed around my ankles and started to drag me downwards. Stupidly, I opened my mouth to scream for help and, of course, blood filled it. I swallowed convulsively without thinking and I gagged. Thank God I had already emptied the contents of my stomach, otherwise, if I had had anything else to throw up then, I would have. The blood closed over me and I couldn't see anything. I struggled to break free of the iron grip around my ankles, pummeling at whatever held them. It let go of me. I swam up towards the distant moonlight, my lungs aching with the need to suck in great lungfuls of air. My head broke the surface right as I heard Margot yell, "Alex, where are you?" I could dimly see her and Jonathan treading water next to the half-hidden door. I spat out the blood from my mouth. "There's something in the water. A coughing fit erupted me. "It dragged me down." God, the taste was awful. I swam towards them, still spitting it out of my mouth. Funny to think that I had been so concerned about grossing Jonathan out earlier, and now I looked like an extra from the set of Carrie. The only comfort that I had was that, although they hadn't been dunked into the blood quite as thoroughly as me, neither Jonathan nor Margot had escaped entirely unscathed. Margot slid her hand along the door before uttering a triumphant cry and wrenching the door open. I expected to see the sea of blood to flow down the stairs, but some invisible barrier had stopped it. The sea simply split around the open doorway. Only a few droplets of blood splattered down onto these steps leading into the darkness. I peered down. "What color is that?" "Gray," said Margot decisively, "and the staircase before that was red." I admired the fact that she had had the presence of mind to note down the color of the last staircase, while we had been running for our very lives. Margot added, "This was easy. I mean, sure, if the sight, smell, touch, and taste of blood doesn't make you puke nonstop." And more to the point, I glanced at her sidelong and said resignedly, "Did you have to jinx it?" Right on cue, the sea started to ripple and churn around us. Frothy blood sprayed out into the night. As we watched, disembodied arms emerged from the depths and reached for us like sunflowers orienting themselves towards the sun. They were small, like the arms of children, but too thin to be anything human. All of them were white and somehow untouched by all that red. And once more, I felt hands brushing against my feet. Cold fingers closed around my ankles. "Let's go," yelled Jonathan. "Move it." I reached out to Margot, and just as our hands had clasped together, the arms below tugged at me in earnest, forcing my head back under the blood and wrenching my arm painfully in its socket. A brief tug-of-war ensued. Margot wouldn't let go, so the hands below began to pull her down with me. I wondered for a moment if I should simply let go of Margot's hand. I was the weak link here. After all, the hands held me and not my friends. But fear overrode my noble intentions and I didn't want to die, especially not like this. My lungs filling with blood and my last sight, the white cliffs, staring down at me impassively. By some miracle, Jonathan pulled both of us through the doorway. 1 second, my hand slid inexorably out of Margot's, my fingernails leaving deep furrows in her skin as I tried to hang on. And next, my feet were on solid ground. It was strange being on the other side of the invisible barrier that stopped the sea. Occasionally, blood sprayed through and onto us. Not that it could do much worse. Our clothes, our hair, our skin, everything dripped in it, and we left puddles behind us. It was going to be even worse when it dried. Jonathan took a deep breath ahead of me. I knew with a sudden fear that he was going to speak. Useless knowledge because there was no way for me to stop him. No way unless I broke one of the rules of the game myself and let go of Margot's hand. "Do you think," said Jonathan, and then he realized his mistake. He clapped his hand over his mouth as if he could stuff the words back down his throat, but it was too late. Those 3 words echoed through the darkness, and the birdsong abruptly stopped, as if someone had switched it off with a remote. I threw a quick glance over my shoulder to try and gauge how many more steps we had to go. The sight wasn't reassuring. Margot tugged at my hand urgently, and I picked up my pace to match hers, even though this meant that I kept nearly slipping on the puddles of blood. Suddenly, a great wind buffeted us, and we were forced to slow to a snail's pace. The wind kept trying to blow us back up the stairs. Hungry shrieks filled the darkness. By then, the flashlights from the backpack were in our hands, but none of them worked save for the one Jonathan held. The sea of blood had ruined nearly everything inside of our backpack. Even that one flashlight sputtered in the darkness, on the verge of going out. Yet it cast enough light to reveal the birds high above us, the ones that had been chirping and singing. Except they weren't birds. I caught a glimpse of something staring down at us with insane, hate-filled eyes. Human eyes, a human face, but it had the body of an enormous eagle. It spread its giant, gray-brown wings, opened its mouth to reveal needle-sharp teeth, and screamed at us with a woman's voice. Other hungry cries filled the air. How had we ever mistaken that for birdsong? We scrambled down the steps as fast as we could, helping each other up whenever one of us fell. Jonathan dropped the flashlight and it didn't matter. We didn't need to see them to know that they were coming for us. I don't know who fell, Jonathan or Margot, but whoever it was brought all of us down. We tumbled down the stairs, thumping against one painful step after another. It was impossible to keep holding hands. I continued to fall head over heels until I smashed into the ground right beside Margot. I staggered up somehow, my ears ringing. I pulled Margot to her feet and her eyes fluttered. She was only half conscious and would have slumped right back down to the ground if I hadn't caught her at the last second. Jonathan was sitting up already, holding his left hand out in front of himself. The fall had crumpled it into something broken and bleeding. Between the two of us, we managed to drag Margot with us as we limped to the door. I tugged on the handle, hearing these shrieks growing louder behind us. By now, the ringing in my ears had fully stopped, and I could hear what sounded like words in the screams behind us. I pulled on that door handle with all of my strength, praying that we weren't too late, praying that we wouldn't feel sharp talons digging into our unprotected backs. And then the door finally opened, and we stumbled through it from one horror to another. The stench hit us at first, the unmistakable aroma of rot and everything associated with it. Bright sunlight illuminated it in all its brutal detail. Corpses, stacked together in huge mounds so that they loomed over us and seemed to stretch into the sky endlessly. The bodies were awful. Those that still had intact faces stared at us unseeingly with their cloudy eyes. It was as if some giant hand had carelessly thrown them to the ground. Yet there was a clear pathway between the bodies. It curved to the left and disappeared from our sight. The sky was black with crows. They flew in circles overhead or perched on the bodies that they could reach. They cawed merrily to each other and us while they feasted on the dead. Some of them had already gorged themselves full, yet they still kept pecking away, tearing away strips from the corpses. As I watched, one crow expertly peeled somebody's face off, revealing the muscle and fat underneath. "It's my turn to throw up," said Jonathan, and he instantly leaned over and vomited noisily. But I didn't feel disgusted. The sight was too much, too unreal. It was like seeing the pages of some illustrated storybook spread out before us. My mind simply could not comprehend it. If I didn't look at the faces of them, I could pretend they weren't real. I could pretend that they were simply Halloween decorations. Yes, that seemed safe. There was no need to examine them any more closely, or to think about how they must have died in pain and terror. Margot groaned. "Where are we?" She started to get up and froze. I cleared my throat. "I think it's some kind of maze." "A maze? Why?" I shrugged, uncomfortable. "I don't know. The way the bodies are stacked, they're like the walls of the labyrinth." I trailed off. I was pretty sure that I was right. It was a labyrinth made of corpses, and the door to the next staircase would be at its center. I glanced at Jonathan. He looked exhausted. Under the sunlight, his hand was even worse than I had thought. 3 fingers had been bent backwards or sideways into broken sticks, and they were beginning to swell. He tried to smile at me. "It's not as bad as it looks." It was exactly as bad as it had looked, maybe even worse. But if pretending otherwise helped him get through this, so much the better. Unlike everyone else, I had been lucky enough to escape the fall with nothing more than a few bruises. Jonathan and Margot's injuries meant that we couldn't go as quickly as we should have, and we kept running into dead ends. I suppose we could have split up or tried to climb through the gaps in the bodies, but by unspoken agreement, we stayed together on the path. None of us said anything aloud, but we all knew that we were running out of time. I watched the sun tread its path across the sky, leaving behind itself flames of blazing yellow, marigold, and pale pink. It was the most beautiful sunset that I had ever seen. I couldn't appreciate it. Its indifferent beauty seemed to mock all the corpses strewn here. Just as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, the corpses woke up. Someone whispered my name. "Alexandra, Alexandra," in a deep, guttural voice. I looked around to see who had spoken and stared straight at the corpse on my right. I couldn't help but take several steps back, my mind reeling in horror. It said in its broken voice, "They came from the sky. We asked them to come down to help us. They rounded us all up and took us into their ships. They killed us, Alex." Another corpse turned its head towards me. The crows had eaten away at its nose and lips, but it still had its eyes. They danced with silver fire as it said, "Alex, I watched my son die. They made me watch. They took my son apart until there was nothing left, and then they all laughed." All around us, the bodies stirred, opened their mouths and spoke. Most talked about the way that they had died. Others talked about their regrets, their mistakes, their loved ones. They all spoke at once so that it was nearly impossible to distinguish one voice from another. I could only catch disjointed words and phrases. Margot stood by the small body of a child, whereas Jonathan stared at a corpse that had only a head and a torso left. I couldn't hear what the dead whispered to them, and I couldn't pretend that these bodies were just Halloween decorations anymore. If we didn't get out of here soon, I was going to lose my mind. I was about to go to my friends to tell them that we had to leave right now, when another corpse spoke from beside me. "Margot is lying to you," it said. "What?" I moved closer. Scraps of flesh clung to its weathered skull, and it stared at me with empty, gaping eye sockets. I waited for it to say more, waited for countless more minutes until I realized that it had said all that it would. I shook my head. It must have lied to me to keep me here longer. I ran over to Margot and had to physically drag her away from the child, my hand tight on her arm. "We need to go, Margot," I said through gritted teeth. Finally, she stopped struggling to get away from me and turned to give me confused eyes. She asked, "How long has it been?" It sounded close to crying. "I don't know," I replied. "Help me with Jonathan." It took the both of us to tug him away, and by then, we were all out of breath and sweating, but we had to hurry. How much time had we lost listening to the dead? We scurried through the labyrinth frantically, trying to keep track of all its twists and turns, keenly aware that our time was running out. When we finally reached the center of the maze, we saw 3 blue doors floating there instead of 1. "Oh crap," said Jonathan, summarizing my own thoughts perfectly. "We'll have to try all of them." I marched forward and opened up the first door on the left. "The staircase in this one is yellow. Margot, is that one of the colors?" "No," said Margot. She made no move to inspect any of the doors herself, and I wondered what the corpse had said to her. Jonathan reached out with his uninjured hand to open another. "This one's blue." "So is this one," I said. "Let's try counting the steps." Both staircases had 100 steps. We both looked at Margot then, because she knew the game best. But she simply gazed back at us. Her face was pale and drawn. She looked like a child who had just seen the monster hiding under her bed. "Margot, come on," I said, trying to sound calm, even though I felt anything but. "Do you have any idea which door to choose?" Margot shook her head. "I don't know, I don't know." Tears spilled out of her eyes. The doorknob shivered under my hand, and suddenly, I was holding something soft and stretchy, as though the doorknob was turning into taffy. I looked across at the door across from Jonathan and saw that it was beginning to melt as well. "Okay, screw this, we're going in," I said, arbitrarily picking the door closest to Jonathan. I strode over and flung it back open even as the doorknob dissolved in my hand, leaving behind a foul-smelling liquid. "Are you sure?" demanded Jonathan. "There's a 50% chance it's the right one," I said. We all went inside, and as the door slammed shut behind us, enclosing us in that now familiar darkness, I prayed that we hadn't chosen the wrong door. We braced ourselves to be attacked again. Instead, the same lovely bird song as before greeted us. We all relaxed in increment, our hands no longer clutching at each other quite so tightly. I couldn't relax all the way though, because now I knew that those things above us weren't actually birds, no matter how much they pretended to be. As we neared what seemed to be the end of the stairs, my heart began pounding an impromptu drum solo. If this staircase had less than 100 steps or more, that meant we, or rather, I, had chosen the wrong door. We could try to run back up the stairs if that was the case, though I didn't hold out much hope that we would make it. Going back upstairs meant breaking yet another rule of the staircase game, which in turn meant something else nasty trying to kill us. At any rate, I would see the other door mounting, so even if we did make it back up in one piece and re-enter the labyrinth, there wouldn't be anywhere else to go. All I could do now was fervently pray that we were on the right staircase. 98, 99, 100. We came to a halt. I craned my neck over my shoulder to see that the steps had ended. We had chosen the right door after all, thank God. If the game rules hadn't expressly forbade talking to each other while on the stairs, I probably would have celebrated our luck by cheering loudly. As it was, I wanted to collapse in relief. Scratch that. I wanted to collapse, period. We're over halfway there, I thought, and tried to squash the hope that followed. I reminded myself that this game probably had tons of more unpleasant surprises in store for us. Jonathan opened the door, and a bizarre sight greeted our eyes. We stood in a spacious room completely made of mirrors. The ceiling, the floor, the walls, every inch of it was covered with mirrors. A soft glow illuminated the room, though we couldn't see where it came from. We could, however, see the white wooden door set at the other end of the room. Like us, it produced infinite reflections. The entire room reminded me of the Infinity Mirror Room's installation series by Kasuma Yayoi. It had that same sense of space and time warping out of joint. Granted, compared to everything else we had been through so far, walking across a room, albeit a large one covered in mirrors, was nothing. "This is too easy," I muttered. I kept staring at the door, expecting it to vanish before my eyes. It stayed stubbornly solid and annoyingly ordinary, as if someone had happened to pluck it from a house in the suburbs and deposited it here. Jonathan said, "Agreed." There was a moment where we simply stood around waiting for something terrifying to appear, but the only things that moved in the room were our own reflections. It was the first time I had seen myself since we had started the game, and I finally realized that we all looked, well, horrible. Itchy, flaky, and dried blood covered us. Our hair and eyelashes were stiff with it. Our eyes and teeth showed very white against all that reddish brown blood. If another human being happened to meet us right now, they would probably run away screaming in the opposite direction. I don't know why the thought struck me as so funny. Probably because one thing after another had been chasing us nearly non-stop for the past few hours, and I was near delirious with exhaustion. Once I started laughing, I couldn't stop, and Jonathan got it. "Good thing no one else we know is here right now," he said, grinning back at me. Even covered in blood, that lopsided smile of his was lovely. My dad would probably have a heart attack. At long last, we were able to sit down and rest for a few minutes. Thanks to the sea of blood, our flashlights, phones, and portable phone chargers were completely ruined. The water bottles and canned food were alright, though the backpack that they had been carried in would never be the same again. "You would think," I said, while trying not to gulp down the canned peaches all at once. "Someone who played the game before could have warned us that the blood would ruin nearly all of our supplies, including the flashlights that they told us to bring. Why not tell us to bring dry bags? Better yet, why not tell us to bring weapons?" Jonathan was too busy wolfing down his own canned peaches to answer, but Margot finally spoke. "It's different for everyone." "What?" "The staircase game is different for everyone. You encounter different things and go to different places. It really depends on what you fear or what you want. The only thing that's the same across all of them is the darkness of the staircases, and what's in the darkness." We both eyed her with hard suspicion, but I was the one who had asked. "How do you know that, Margot?" She heaved a deep sigh. "I talked to Pharaoh's 7921 before we came here. His real name is Lucian Hammond, and he's played the staircase game a few times now." Before I could respond, Jonathan said with an edge in his voice, "That would have been helpful to know, I don't know, at any previous point before we started playing this game." "Is there anything else that you want to share?" I added. Margot shook her head and clammed up again. Frankly, it was eerie to see her so silent and downcast. She had been able to shrug off everything else so far. Now that we were no longer running for our lives, I personally was struggling not to dwell on these shapes that had broken through the doors in the desert. Although I didn't enjoy being stuck in a constant state of fear, at least then my brain was too occupied with surviving to focus on anything else. "We should get going," said Jonathan unenthusiastically. "Yeah." Neither of us made any effort to stand up. As the adrenaline receded, fatigue took its place and my eyelids seemed to weigh 100 pounds. If I could have slept here, with solid reassurance that the door wouldn't disappear on us, I would have had zero trouble passing out in the cold, hard glass. It felt as though we had been stuck in the game for decades already. Margot stood up and started walking over to the door because, of course she did. It occurred to me then that Jonathan had been right. She was more focused on winning the game than going home. Her secrecy over what she knew about the staircase game and her behavior recently had crossed the line from stubborn to obsessive. She went to the door as though she didn't feel the hunger and exhaustion the rest of us felt, or even any pain from her fall down the stairs. Worried, I got up to follow her, only to see that all of her reflections stood still, out of sync with her. One of them waved at me sardonically. I heard the sound of breaking glass, as if someone had accidentally dropped a stack of dishes on the floor, or shattered a mirror. Jonathan said from behind me, "Alex." I turned around. For a full minute, I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. I looked up to Jonathan's smiling face and down to where his hand rested on my shoulder. It was the injured hand, the one that he had been cradling close to his chest while we ate our food. Except it was whole and perfect again. And then I looked at the shard of glass held in that hand, roughly 6 inches long and 2 across, the shard that he had shoved all the way through my left shoulder. There was no pain, not yet. I whispered, "Jonathan." Some instinct made me look down at where his reflection should have been, and I saw another Jonathan staring up at us, trapped behind the glass. My Jonathan. He screamed something at me, but I couldn't hear what he said because the thick glass muffled his words. He started slamming his hands against the glass, leaving bloody smears on it as he tried to punch his way through. And then the other Jonathan pulled the shard back out of my shoulder, and that hurt. It burned, and the pain cleared my head enough that I could think again. Blood spurted out of my wound as I pushed him away, or I tried to. I couldn't move my left arm at all. It hung from my punctured shoulder, dead and useless. The other Jonathan evaded me easily, and wrapped one hand into my hair so he could pull my neck back and dig the tip of the shard into my throat. "Any last words?" he said mockingly. I was hoping for a snappy comeback to come to mind. The best I could do was refuse to give him the satisfaction of begging for my life. I slammed my elbow into his stomach and heard him give out a small oof sound. Then I twisted around and grabbed the shard from his slackening hand. I nearly succeeded in shoving it into his throat, except by then one of my own reflections had risen out of the mirror behind me like an evil ghost. She forced my arm up and away from the other Jonathan, and then used her to hold on to me to throw me across the room. On one hand, she had thrown me towards the door instead of away from it. On the other hand, I couldn't leave Jonathan behind. I scrambled to my feet, shaking my head to try and clear it out of the gray spots dancing across my vision. I managed to take 2 steps towards where I could still see him trapped in the mirror, and then Margot yanked me backwards by my injured arm. Pain exploded through it, and I could barely hear her say, "Alex, we have to go." "Jonathan's still here," I snarled at her. "We can still save him, get him out." Even as I said it though, I knew it wasn't true. More of our reflections had stepped out of the reflections of the white doors and the mirrors. 10 other Jonathans, 10 other Margos, and 10 other me's stood between us and Jonathan. And more were coming. An infinite number of them pushing their way out of the mirrors as if the mirrors were made of water and not glass. Those reflections early in the room started running towards us, their eyes burning bright with bloodlust. Margot dragged me backwards. "It's too late. We can't help Jonathan. We don't have a choice." "Yes, we do." I screamed the words so loudly that my throat ached. "Let go of me." She didn't. She dragged me away from the room and through the doorway, toward the final white staircase waiting for us. I watched our reflections stop chasing us. I watched them turn towards where Jonathan was still trapped. They converged on him, dropping down to put their faces right by the glass above him. And the very last thing I saw, before they completely surrounded him and the door slammed shut, was Jonathan staring at us with agonized, despairing eyes, still beating on the glass. I immediately tore myself free from Margot and ran towards the door. Only rough wood at my fingertips, no doorknob. I tried to wrench it back open anyways, wrapping my fingers around the edges of the door and ignoring the sharp splinters. Right then, I didn't care about the staircase game or its dumb rules. I didn't even care about going home. What I cared about was Jonathan, and the way that he had looked at us as we left him behind. And then the door began melting under my hands. No, 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 I thought. I tried to hold it in place, like I thought the door would turn solid again if I could just make it stay still. Margot touched my shoulder and I shook her off violently, unable to even look at her. Part of me knew she probably had been right, and that there was no way we could have saved Jonathan, at least not without getting ourselves trapped behind the mirrors too. Yet a larger part of me seethed with rage. We could have at least tried. How could she have abandoned him like that? I don't know how long I spent in the darkness trying to get the rapidly disappearing door back open. I did everything I could think of. At one point, I ran to the other side of it and tried to open it from there, alternating between pushing and pulling. I even flung myself through it as it disappeared. But that didn't work either. In the end, as the last of the door dissolved in front of my eyes, all I could do was stare at the empty space where it had been half a minute before. When Margot reached out to me, I didn't bat her hand away again. My mind was completely blank. I followed her obediently down the steps because I couldn't think of what else to do. Had I missed some obvious way to open the door? Was it completely impossible to reopen after it closed? Or had I simply not tried hard enough? Halfway down the stairs, I contemplated simply sitting down and refusing to move. Yet that wouldn't bring me any closer to saving Jonathan either. Eventually, I realized that my best bet was to make it through the next door. Maybe there would be more doors on the other side of it, doors that connected back to the mirror room. So when Margot pulled open the door at the end of the staircase, I didn't try to dash back up the stairs again. I stepped through it without hesitation, and I had to shield my eyes from the warm sunlight that shone down on us, so bright that it didn't seem real. As my vision adjusted, I saw that we stood in the center of a beautiful meadow, roughly the size of 2 football fields. Daffodils grew everywhere, nodding cheerfully at us, and the air smelled like spring, green and new, the scent of wet earth and growing things. It was spring here and it would always be spring. I looked across the meadow and saw a black door, only one and no others beside it, on the riverbank closest to us. The river looked polluted. It was black as well, and it rushed around the whole meadow in a giant loop enclosing us. The other riverbank, way past the door, was shrouded in a gray, nearly opaque mist. I couldn't make out anything on that riverbank except for a boat of some kind that sat at the very edge of the bank. A tiny, rickety boat that bobbed up and down in the furious current, one stiff breeze away from falling apart. I took a deep breath, the better to yell at Margot when unexpectedly contentment stole over me. It was the kind of contentment you feel when it's a cold winter night, and you're safely ensconced at home with your loved ones. You're sitting in cozy armchairs beside the fireplace, and a really good book in your hands, and you can hear the wind howling and furiously yanking at your windows. Knowing that it's absolutely awful outside only makes you more grateful to be warm and safe inside. That kind of contentment. If I stayed here, I would feel that contentment forever. No more arguments, no more worries, no more fear ever again. I could let go of all my rage and self-loathing. It was incredibly tempting, and I most likely would have given in if Jonathan's face hadn't flashed across my mind right then. The peace didn't disappear entirely. It simply lessened enough for me to decide that it wasn't yet time for me to stay here. I turned to Margot, ready to shake the answers out of her if necessary. Luckily for her, I didn't have to. She saw the look on my face and said, "I can explain." I glared at her, fist clenched tightly by my side. "I'm waiting." "The staircase game gives you whatever you want. That's what Lucien told me," What he didn't tell me is that the game needs a sacrifice before it gives you anything. She took a deep breath. I saw my sister back there, Alex. I saw her in the labyrinth. She told me that she had died because of me. She started to cry again. I stared at her, my anger momentarily forgotten. That's impossible, Margot. You were 3 years old when she had died. She told me that I fell into the pool, that the reason she died is because she went in after me. She helped me out, Alex, and she drowned in there all by herself. I wanted to tell Margot that she must have heard a lie, but actually, it had a horrible ring of truth to it. I remember the corpse telling me Margot was lying, and it had been right. Unwillingly, I felt a moment's sympathy for Margot. Margot threw a pleading look at me. The whole reason I ever wanted to play this game was to bring her back. I had to keep going, don't you see? Her confession rendered me silent for a few minutes, and then my anger roared back to life and I said, So you decided to sacrifice one of us. How did you choose Jonathan? Or was it supposed to be me? No, said Margot quickly. I would never sacrifice you. So what? You didn't give a crap about Jonathan. I chose you, Alex. I chose you and my sister. I shook my head. No, that's not true. You chose yourself like always. Suddenly, I was close to crying myself, except my tears were born of rage. I had always known that Margot had missed her sister. Just because she couldn't remember Marianne that well didn't mean she loved her any less. Yet I never thought Jonathan and I would have to pay for the cost of that love. How could she have lied to us? How could she possibly stand there, trying to justify herself if she hadn't condemned Jonathan to being trapped in the game for the rest of his life? Tell me how to get back to the mirror room. I can save Jonathan without your help. I waited for her to respond, only to find her staring past me. I followed her gaze to see the dead walking towards us. They came out of the river. They started out as dark, gray figures with indistinguishable features, and then the closer they got to us, the more clearly I could see them, except they stayed pale and ghostly, like they were barely there. How did I know that they were dead? Because Marianne led the pack. She could have been Margot's twin. Only the slightest of differences set them apart, as if someone had set out to create two identical figurines, and his hand had slipped at the last second. They had the same build, the same heart-shaped face and the same eyes, except Marianne was taller and her hair was wavy instead of straight. She was inexplicably older too, our age maybe, or the age she would have been if she had lived. Margot ran to her. It was my turn to grab for her, to hold her still, but she slipped through my grasp like water. I ran after her even though a tiny voice inside my head screamed at me to get out, to leave before it was too late. Even though I was still angry at Margot, angry enough that I never wanted to see her again, I knew somehow that if I left her to the dead, they would do something unspeakable to her, and maybe she would deserve it. But I didn't want to be the one to decide that. The dead stopped moving. They waited for us to come to them, their eyes as dull and dusty as marbles. Margot finally slowed down when she had reached Marianne. She stopped beside Marianne, as if she couldn't believe her sister was finally here. I stopped as well, still a good distance back from them. "Margot," I called, "get away from them." It was like she couldn't hear me. Or maybe she simply didn't want to. She threw her arms around Marianne and hugged her tightly. Marianne didn't return the embrace. She was as lifeless and unmoving as a doll. "Let's go, Marianne," Margot said. "Let's get out of here." She tugged at her sister, and Marianne actually walked forward a couple of steps before stopping. Margot dropped her sister's hand as if it had burned her. "I can't leave," said Marianne. Her voice was the eerie sound of branches scratching at your window late at night. Nothing human. Stay with us. I knew with instant clarity how the staircase game had interpreted Margot's wish. She probably thought, I want to see my sister again, and the game was fulfilling exactly that wish. Nothing more and nothing less. I also knew Margot well enough to predict her response. I screamed at her anyways, even though I know it wouldn't make a difference. Don't, Margot, don't! Margot didn't even spare me a glance. Instead, she kept staring at her sister, the agony playing on her face. She couldn't go back. She had lied to herself every step of the way here, telling herself that her friends didn't need to know why she wanted to win the game or even what she could get if she won. She had told herself that the game wouldn't affect us. And then when she found out that it did, and in the worst way possible, she tried to justify it all with simple math. One life was going in and one life was going back out. It wasn't really wrong to do this. If she went back home empty-handed with Marianne still rotting in her grave, and Jonathan worse than dead, that was as much as admitting that she had made a mistake, that she had majorly screwed up. And Margot never ever made mistakes. Margot licked her lips nervously and gave a single nod. And the dead tore her apart. They reached out with terribly strong hands and they tore off her limbs, her head, and they dug their hands into all that meat. They ripped her open the way you tear apart the wrapping paper of a Christmas present. She didn't even have time to scream. They sprayed her blood and stray teeth into the air and then scooped up handfuls of it and stuffed it into their mouths, smacking their lips in enjoyment. It was like watching a swarm of beetles and maggots and rats devouring a dead deer. They ate like they had been starving for 100 years, 1,000. As they ate her, the color returned to their faces and bodies. They looked alive again. And then one of them looked up to see me still standing there, frozen by sheer horror. They all turned as one to stare at me, like the many heads of one creature, with drooling jaws and vacant eyes. I took that as a sign to start running. I sprinted past them towards the door on the riverbank. To keep the exhaustion at bay, I made myself think about what I had just seen. The red ruin that Margot had become in a matter of seconds, and told myself that I couldn't go out like that. I ran without having any idea if they were still eating her, or if they had started running after me. I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own breathing. The black wooden door grew closer and closer until it loomed over me, impossibly tall. I could hear them now, their feet slapping down on the ground as they tried to reach me before I escaped. I imagined their hands grasping for any part of me, my hair or my clothes or my useless left arm. I opened the door and tumbled through without really seeing what was on the other side. Immediately, I scrambled up to check whether any of them had followed me through the open door, their hands outstretched into claws and their red mouths gaping. There was nothing there. No door, just an empty street. An ordinary empty street that I had walked along many times before, on my way to school or to Margot's house. Everywhere I turned, I saw normal shops, normal houses and apartments, normal cars and bikes, normal people going about their everyday lives, laughing or talking loudly. There wasn't a single staircase in sight. I survived the staircase game. Any sane person would be grateful to simply still be alive. And I am grateful, I am. When we had first started the game, we had been so sure of ourselves, so certain that the game would turn out to be either a hoax or completely harmless. We thought that we were invincible. We were wrong. No time had passed at all since we had first entered the game and I came back out, the only survivor. I didn't bother attending my college orientation or any of the classes that I had signed up for a month ago. Instead, I focused on trying to learn more about the staircase game. Yet no matter how hard or how often I scoured the internet and various paranormal discussion forums, I only ever got the same posts that I had already reread 100 times. At one point, I became so frustrated that I reached out to Lucien, Pharaoh's 7921, even though I suspected he had been the one to dangle Marianne in front of Margot like a carrot. I responded to all of his old posts, sent countless PMs to him, all with no response. Either he's ignoring me or he's somewhere where there's no phone service and no Wi-Fi. I wonder if he's playing the game again, and if so, who he's playing it with. The truth is, guilt and self-loathing eat at me every day and every hour, every minute and every second of every day. Each night I go to sleep, I'm back in the game watching Jonathan scream at me from behind the mirrors or Margot being torn apart. I keep wondering why I was the one who survived. I replay everything that happened during the game over and over again, analyzing each moment to see if I could have done anything differently. If there was really any logic to the way that the world worked, then I should have been the one who lost the game, not Jonathan or Margot. Was it really through pure chance, pure luck that I survived? Which brings me to today. I woke up this morning realizing that there's only one thing left to do. I have to play the staircase game again. You probably think I'm crazy, but I want to. No, I need to rescue Jonathan. In my dreams, his reflections are hunting me down as he wanders the cold and colorless world behind the mirrors. I need him to know that despite what it looked like, I didn't give up on him. I haven't given up on him. Don't get me wrong, I'm not going to sacrifice anyone for Jonathan, no matter how much I love him. Unlike Margot, I'm not selfish enough to think that trading one person's life for another is a fair trade. And even if I did, I wouldn't lie to myself. I wouldn't pretend that I was doing the right thing, or that I had no choice about doing it. That's why I wrote this post. If you've read all of this and believe me, then you know everything that I do about the game. I'm searching for someone who understands the risks, someone who is brave enough and curious enough to play anyways. Maybe someone who's so unhappy here that they would jump at the chance to explore another world. Or someone who wants to study the game, run experiments on it and make new scientific discoveries. Or maybe someone who survived similar supernatural games before. Someone who's always believed in the paranormal, and who knows how dangerous a simple game can be. If that sounds like you, please reach out to me. You and I can play the staircase game together.